And welcome back
Big
to
arms. We're doing big arms.
We're on.
the Wednesday Club.
Big arms.
Big arms.
Wednesday arms.
Wednesday Club.
My name is Amy Dallen.
I'm Taliesin Jaffe.
My name is Matthew Key.
And if you are absolutely brand new to comics, have you come to the right place? Today is our Welcome to Comics episode, Comics 101. We've had a lot of call over the course of this show as we've gone deep on crossovers and history and the Silver Age and all this stuff for sort of a like, okay, but back up. What are we even talking about?
What are we
How
even
does
talking
reading
about?
comics work?
How does it work?
Yeah. How does it work?
How does it work?
I'm panicking, Amy. I'm panicking.
Words,
Don't panic!
pictures,
Large,
don't panic.
friendly letters.
I'm panicking.
We were specifically requested. Thank you. It looks amazing.
This is I love.
Oh.
I don't even know.
Oh.
I was like trying to figure out where all of the different.
Oh
like,
my God. Oh.
Like, there's
well,
a doc-
Ken Wynn just became one of my favorite people
There's
alive.
like the Captain America C, the X-Men X. There's so much happening. The little curvy eye, I love it.
The Eye of Agamotto. We got the X-Men.
It's
But if you have
lovely.
no
Is
idea
that
what
House
any
of
of that
Mystery
is,
M?
that's fine too. Because today is about
Now I'm
starting at
playing
the
the game,
beginning. So we have framed up, this
Sorry,
was our
Amy.
recommended reading for today, and it is much more advanced than the stuff we're talking about, but we also love to shout it out because it's just,
It is the book.
it is the book. The book was written on comics by Scott McCloud in the early 1990s. And he sort of, before it, had pretty much only been this, which is an incredible reference by a classic comic book artist and writer named Will Eisner. But it's designed sort of, it's a very, like, it's a technical manual for people who want to make and understand comics, and is written as a textbook with a lot of example pictures, where Scott McCloud was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to talk about comics with a comic. And it is literally a comic book introduction to the concept of comics. And this, for those who caught last week's show, I was really amazed by this because I went back to reread this, having owned it obviously a long time. And I had never noticed just how well constructed it is. The opening section of this. The opening of Scott
I'll pull
McCloud's
over and
Understanding
do that.
Comics consists of 2 pages where we start investigating our subject and one closing panel called This is Where Our Journey Begins.
And then, boom.
And begin it does. With this, which is sort of a perfect image to start us out, the world of comics is a huge and varied one. Our definition must encompass all these types. And this is where Scott McCloud starts to break down the idea of what do we mean when we say comics. So there we go. What do we mean when we say comics, guys? What's a comic?
A Marvel book.
Oh,
Sorry,
It's a
okay.
DC book.
oh.
Taliesin's wrong.
Discuss.
This is a very illustrative of how easy it is to sort of mistake the forest for the trees in some ways.
Well, and I also think it's kind of like, though we are joking, it is somewhat indicative of kind of the modern climate that superhero comics are comics. And it's like, as we've discussed before, no, those are a particular genre within a particular medium, in the same way that we can get action adventure comics, in the same way we get mystery or horror or any genre that you can get a film in, you can have as a comic.
So, principle number 1, comics is not a genre. Comics is a medium. It is a way of telling stories or doing non-narrative art pieces. Mostly narrative. That's getting into that definition.
We can say mostly narrative. I think that's fair.
Another term for comics, one that's grown in currency recently, is sequential art. And this is the idea that it is art that tells a story laid out over space, which is a pretty convenient definition. I also was brainstorming around for the essence of comics. It was like, whether it's Peanuts or Penny Arcade, Persepolis, Punisher, or Pokemon.
Wow, alliteration all the same.
Yeah.
Pretty
Those
poignant.
are all
Wow,
comics.
well done. Well done. Toast the coffee.
Comics have a long history. Any story that you tell laid out with pictures that pass over time essentially is a forerunner to what we now know as sequential art. There's some great stuff on this in the early McCloud where he's going into South American tapestries and French tapestries, the Bayeux tapestry particularly.
And like Egyptian hieroglyphs and such.
And looking at them and the ways that they tell stories using pictures across space.
Such as?
visual aid.
Ba-dum-bum.
That's at the beginning of the book, just saying, hey, comics have been around for longer than anyone really says.
But they got much, much easier once we invented printing, once printing got cheap, and once especially disposable paper newspapers came around, and people started doing Sunday funnies, which, of course, comic strips are one of the earliest and best known forms of comics. This is why things like Peanuts and Foxtrot and Family Circus are all comics.
I'll even go so further back. One of my favorite classic comic strips would be Little Nemo in Slumberland.
Yes.
Which is,
Wow.
I was actually reaching for one of those for an example of layout.
Oh, layout.
But,
We'll go
I couldn't
there.
find it, so...
Yeah,
I'll
no,
just
well, which
describe
was
it.
originally Little Nemo is the adventures of a boy who dreams, and sort of when he dreams, he goes to an Oz-like fairyland where he has powers and meets magical creatures. It's very Wizard of Oz with like a little boy in his pajamas, and it was originally published in the 19th. It's been published since the 19th century in a magazine called Punch. Was, I believe, its original home. I am pulling this out of my brain. I did not actually look this up this week. I'm just remembering this.
I did not know it
Could be
originated in
iffy.
Punch, but it sounds legit.
Punch magazine was like one of the great illustrated collection magazines for the. There we go. Thank you. There's a Little Nemo right there.
Excellent.
Leave it to Zach.
And it
Winsor McKay is the writer-artist of this strip. It is one of the most famous, early, most creative comics. It established a lot of the crazy ideas that other people would try to follow up on, which one of the interesting things to look at, especially in Western comics, is you can often trace who was the first person to sort of like, this person had the idea of sound effects. This person had the idea of this kind of panel transition.
and it, especially for newspapers and periodicals before the invention of the camera, the illustration was such a serious part of how any story would get told. Any story, even British newspapers, if you go back to any of the early 19th century British newspapers, it's all sketch. It's all drawings of people, drawings of things that happened. Someone's imagination of how
There's
a crime went down.
a lot of engraving and a lot of cartooning. That's sort of just a normal part of their publishing process.
And even in Japan, in like feudal era of Japan, one of the ways that you would spread news is people would draw sequential art of like things that were interesting that were happening, and move that sequential art as like a actual document through the country. It was small enough that you could do that. This is nothing new, but I'm sorry, I've taken mine.
No, this is perfect.
There's mine.
No, I got nothing to add.
That's
to
all
it.
I
There are
got.
all these. There are many sort of global sources and inventions of this idea of telling stories, usually with a combination of words and pictures, not always, but to use that to tell a story over space, which, as you pointed out last time, and as McLeod makes the point of early on, differs from something like animation and film because they tell stories over time. They replace the image with a new one, whereas images in comics and other what was originally print media but is visually laid out, they occupy relative space. And the two differences there are like telling a story with space rather than time, and that they fall in the line of books rather than movies because you control the flow of information.
Can I throw this bug into your bed?
Yeah.
That we now are getting things like Marvel's Infinite Comics.
Oh yeah.
Like
And
this
now
is
comes
this
the
is
playing with the forms.
I think at the end of the show we talk about Infinite. I'll actually see if I can pull up the Avengers versus X-Men Infinite book, which was the one where like
Oh, man,
I pulled up the Infinite book and went, "What is this madness?"
the Gamora one is like that was my first like the Gamora Infinite comic was my first one where I was like, ooh, this is actually kind of cool.
Do you want to explain what it is, or should I explain what it is, or should we wait? We'll wait.
It's a one-on-one,
advanced.
we'll get there.
It's advanced.
Okay, it's advanced. But I'm gonna make a note on our
our
cards.
cards.
Ah, we
But
have cards. We
yeah.
have cards.
And
I'm
an
so proud
important
of
thing
us.
to talk about is that every definition we're going to set out has been challenged or pushed by someone, going back to Little Nemo. And that's what's tremendously exciting about what, even though we're talking about these historical roots that go back millennia, the form in other ways is very young. It's been developed in really interesting ways in different regions of the world. In Asia, in Western Europe, in America, there's these distinct traditions, and in many other places, there's a ton of South American comics that I keep hearing about from customers that just haven't been reprinted in English that were just massively influential and creative. More global reprinting. But we will tend to focus in on different traditions. We just don't want to lose sight of the fact that we're working in this broader context, that everyone is experimenting and rubbing off on each other over time, especially over the course of the 20th century.
Yeah, and it's very much like talking about what is painting at that point, where while we may start with that definition of painting is a two-dimensional image on a surface, then you can start talking about a Van Gogh painting where it's all actually three-dimensional texture, which is now getting involved. There's always a push to the medium, and so any attempt to define it is always going to have outliers, but this is going to be not about the outliers. So I know you guys in the chat will be like, what about this book? I'm like, yes, we know. We know.
And soon you will too. And the goal here is, if you in the chat, many of you already know this, but part of the deal here is that comics have earned a reputation for being a little bit difficult to get into. And there are really good reasons that people have those worries about it. But we are here to smash those worries. To smash those ideas, because as the lovely makers of the shirt point out, comics are for everybody. Even if you don't think you're already a comics fan, there's a chance that there's a bunch of comics you already love that you may have just forgotten to think of. There are folks who forget that, like, oh, Saga counts. Oh, Fun Home counts.
But that's because so many people, again, like think, oh, comics are for superheroes. Like, this Saga is just a sci-fi with pictures. And it's like, no, that's a comic. Yeah.
It's told visually in narrative sequential panels.
Heathcliff counts.
Heathcliff counts.
Marmaduke counts.
So
Marmaduke
not only
totally
is there
counts.
a good chance you are already a comic book fan, but if you are a comics fan...
Marmaduke's not an outlier, but yeah, carry on. Sorry.
So I do have a question, though.
But if you are, what I was just meaning to say is, if you're in chat right now and you already know all of this, your mission is to be that welcoming voice for everyone else when they have questions. Because comics is still a tiny industry and a tiny group of readers compared to how many people we could have enjoying all of this stuff all of the time. So help us be part of our army. Thank you.
Help us spread the good news of comics.
But in a not creepy way, but yes. Essentially that, yes.
I had to say it that way because I was in seminary.
Yeah.
The Greek word for gospel, by the way, I believe is euangelion. It means the good news.
Evangelion.
Ah, nice. Family
book.
Circus. Is that a comic?
Okay.
Because Family Circus is typically
one
panel with like some nonsense that happens in it, and that's it. Like every once in a while there'll be something sequential. So the question, as innocuous as it may seem and kind of jokey, can you have a comic when it's not sequential art?
I actually have a response if you don't.
Okay, what's your?
Because I was thinking, because you brought up Marmaduke, and I'm like, Marmaduke's one of those weird outliers, which is there is a form of comic that is a single picture and usually a caption. It's a picture and caption, which is a cartoon, technically not a comic, but which is why they don't call it a comic strip, because the strip is a series of them. So there's no time passing in that. I consider that to be kind of a form of almost like a Zen koan. It's one of those. It's like a momentary gong hitting, and it's just supposed to be this idea that resonates. And while it's not a movement in time, it is a moment in time.
A one-liner is humor, but not all humor is a one-liner.
Sure.
So maybe a single-panel gag could be a subset of comics, even though it doesn't fit in our definition of sequential, stories
art.
told over the course of space. Now, technically, if we get loose enough with that definition, we're just going to get back to, like, paintings.
Yeah.
And so everything is comics, literally everything in the world.
The Mona Lisa, a comic.
Comics. The internet,
A very dull one.
Comics.
Gravity, comics.
But yeah, it's one of those outliers where the rules have definitely shifted a bit, but only because, and it gets grouped because of it. It's one of those, it's art, there's always going to be outliers, and that's one of my favorite, is the single panel.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, I love those. And I didn't mean, again, it sounds like a joke, like, what about Family Circus,
But
you
it
guys?
really,
But
it
it's,
tests our definition.
it does
yeah.
test
talk
the
about
definition,
this.
exactly. Yeah, we're nerds. That's what we do.
So
We test the definitions.
I'm so excited with where we're going
other
now.
question is about like formats and speaking of single panel comics, when we say comics, like some people will ask, is this comics? That looks like a book. And my answer, yes.
Yeah.
This is a trade paperback collection with a bunch of comics in it. Everything you see is comics because, as previously established, everything in the universe is comics. But also, more specifically, all of this is comics. Because comics is the stuff happening in here. And whether it's published in an issue, this is what we call an issue. This is one single issue comic. Originally sold for $6.95 because it's an indie, and indies tend to be expensive. It contains a small-ish number of pages, usually between 15 and 40, depending on the comic.
This is a collection, like a trade paperback collection?
This is a trade paperback collection. It contains several issues. Issues can have different frequencies of publication. They are often easiest to think of as episodes of a TV show. And this applies... Sorry, I did this out of order. This applies primarily to the modern American comic book publishing industry. That is the one still dealing with what we think of as single issues. In Europe, it's much more common to have stories come out in an all-at-once chunk.
I'll do Japan after this one.
Yeah. I was going to bring an example of a giant digest, and then
That's
I forgot.
fine. I'll bring one next week.
So this, although hilariously it has a sequel, so technically it was 2 chunks, is a really wonderful comic published out of France about Marjan Satrapi's childhood in Iran during the revolution. You may have seen or run into it because it was adapted into a film which won a prize at Cannes. But it is a graphic novel autobiography. And in this case, we're using the term graphic novel to indicate that this is intended to be one story chunk. While smaller pieces of it may be published elsewhere, it is different from, say, Hawkeye, which was originally published as a series of independent issues, which were then collected together into this paperback collection.
A single story
Even though
in
they
a
were also
serialized
intended
in a
to-
serialized story. There's stuff about Hawkeye that comes before this, and there's stuff that's after it. It's a character in an adventure, in a series of adventures. Would you actually?
Although this author has made sure to use the format he's going to be working in to his advantage by creating smaller arcs and self-contained effects that you get from reading this collection or from his particular run on Hawkeye.
And it does seem that a lot of, at least American comics, especially with like Marvel and DC and probably even Image, really do that, where it's like, cool, we're going to do a 6-issue or 5-issue arc. We'll then put that into a trade paperback, and then we'll move on to the next story. Like with Doctor Strange, you get the Way of the Weird.
This, in the year 2017, this is basically the dominant model for American comics now.
Yeah.
But it hasn't always been that way.
It's not.
There was a time when every issue was designed to stand alone. The byword was, every comic is someone's first. If you didn't explain who the people were and what was going on, you had failed at your job. And we joke about it now because you read old comics and they reintroduce
bulky.
the characters in every issue. But it had its advantages. It was more like watching an episode of CSI, where they will basically make sure you know what's going on. And it doesn't depend on you seeing 20 episodes before it comes.
It's one of the reasons we kind of make fun of Claremont and his X-Men, because he was still introducing every single character beginning, but also trying to recap everything that happened. And it always resulted in like very bulky exposition.
For people
And your
who are,
mileage may vary because for some people it worked really, really well, but it also
I'm not
does
complaining.
read
I
as
love it.
dated in certain ways.
It is the TV format that would be, if you can imagine every episode being a pilot. And that can be a little, especially if you're trying to tell a story like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where and if you watch this kind of TV, they basically, you'll notice that they introduce everybody and explain to you who they are for the first 2 episodes of every season.
But
First 2 episodes, you get everyone's name and what they do and how they relate to everyone is like said out loud. Now, if you can imagine if they did that every single episode, no matter what's happening.
But think about something like the show Columbo. You don't need to have seen any other episode of Columbo
No.
to meet this detective and watch him solve a crime. They're not
It was
depending
all
on you having any
standalone.
previous knowledge, even though it obviously does work as like one dude's life over time. You know, he doesn't get killed off in one episode and then magically come back the next time. So they work as a long form, like internal continuity, if you will. But each one can be watched completely independently in basically any order.
Yeah.
I'll talk about Japanese, how they do in Japan
So
now.
what's
since,
this?
Since this is kind of one of my areas of vague expertise.
here it is.
You have a mark and give me some.
I was just going to pick out a page to look at later when we're doing.
This
how
is a
to
great
read
book, by the way.
page. I
Um,
love that book.
This book. So how they do it in Japan, what is most frequent is they have digests or collections that come out weekly. They have Shonen
Big
Weekly
phone book size things.
with
and
phone
I have
book
one at home and I
paper.
forgot it.
with like really, really cheap paper,
Really cheap paper.
black and white, and it's a weekly, and you get about 7 to 10 pages. You don't get a lot, but you get 15 different books that are all, in theory, going to probably appeal to the same people. You get the boy. There's like comics for boys, comics for girls, comics for men, comics for women, comics for businessmen, and it's like it's thick. It's really, really thick, and it's weekly, and there's just these big tomes of cheap paper. And then once they have enough of a single issue to collect it, they get collected in what is usually a much smaller book than this. The original printing for something like this is bigger. It's a little bit bigger of a book.
In the weekly one, or
in
when
the
they collect it first?
And then when they collect it, it's actually smaller.
Tankobon. They're super
They go
cute.
about, actually, it's much smaller than this book. I'll bring one in, and they will just collect like about 2 months worth, and you'll get these single issues, collectible issues that people will get, mostly because there's not a lot of space in Japan. You can only have so much, and like there's just really not the room for all of this ridiculousness. And it's nice and it's compact, and you can bring it with you, and it's a lot of people read on trains in Japan. This is like one of the big things. So you'll buy your 250-page book at the newsstand for the week, and this is just what you carry with you all week while you're on the subway or while you're waiting for.
And this, we'll get into this next week. But one thing that we, as American comic book readers, one thing we envy about Japan's comic book industry is that a magical transformation happened in the late 50s, early 60s there that didn't quite happen here. While over here we had a moral panic about how comics would be bad for kids, and so they needed to be scrubbed to be kid-friendly. Somehow, that is not what happened in Japan.
Went the other way.
Japan was like,
entirely.
Comics, anyone could read them. And they had a much bigger head start on working in different genres. So there's a lot less of a fight over there about which kinds of stories can be told in comics.
There is no fight over there.
There's no
There
fight.
is
I try not to idealize it, and I'm like, well, maybe it's not as good as I think it is, and people are like, it is.
It is as good as you think it is. And I'm actually next week we'll get into manga, and I'll start.
Manga is the Japanese term for comics.
I will start with Tezuka. We're going to start at Big Daddy, and we're going to make our way probably all the way into the 80s, because I'm not as I'm not as up as what's happening now. But
yeah, we said this on the live stream beforehand, but next week is manga.
Next week is
and
manga.
It's going to be basically history of manga part 1, essentially, because we're just going to do sort of early-ish stuff.
I'm cheating because I already kind of have a lecture that I give on this at convention, so I'm just going to be like stealing a lot from that.
Amazing.
God. Yeah, it's gonna be fun. I'm a big Tezuka fan. I'm a big Takahashi fan. It's gonna get real.
Question about the digest that you're talking about, because this is the first time I've ever heard that.
I'll bring one in. It's great.
So you get these digests. Would that be the same thing as like Marvel or DC, like putting 10 pages of every single one of their stories into one digest? Is it like per publisher? Like, how do you? Is it a Reader's Digest, but for comics? So it's like all these independent artists all submitting their work to one publisher?
No,
like,
it's actually, that's a good question. While they will vary a bit, it's pretty much you get licensed to do this, and you're expected to make your 10 pages be a 10-page. It feels very much a little bit like someone took the weekly strips that you get in the newspaper, especially if you've ever seen like The Amazing Spider-Man, the weekly strip, where 3 panels of Spider-Man, 4 panels of Spider-Man a day is kind of how you deal. But they're doing the 10-page version of that, of 10 pages forward in a story every week is it creates kind of a staccato interesting, and we'll talk about how, once everyone understands how panel speed works, we'll talk about panel speed work. Now, I can talk about panel speed work next week because we're going to cover it.
Do we want to talk about panel speed now? Is
Well,
that a segue?
Well, I was just gonna finish this just because it was a good question, but like it's really designed more to be like your serials that you would watch before a film. It's very much 10 pages of the stories you're gonna read, and there'll be a new one in there every now and then. But getting into those big phone books is a task, and once you're producing that 7 to 10 pages, I'll find out what the actual page count is. That's kind of what you do. There's a lot of cigarette smoking amongst comic book writers in Japan, and also artists and writers are the same person in Japan. Very rarely will you have 2 people.
It's much more common.
It's one person.
Long runs are more common, and writer-artists are more common.
Decade-long runs.
The small chunks and the publisher question is very interesting, because when you're talking about Marvel and DC, you're not just talking about publishers, but what we take for granted, but is actually quite strange, the idea that a publisher is telling stories in one shared universe. And Shonen Jump, for instance, which is one of the like classic anthology
Boy
format
books.
like comics, manga publishers, or like that's the magazine. It doesn't mean that all the stories in Shonen Jump can touch each other and are happening in the same world, but they've contacted whatever artists and studios they're interested in and said, you, bring us Naruto.
And if that writer and artist stops, that character is most likely gone. Like it's not that Shonen owns the character and is going to keep publishing it. It happens every now and then, but it's very rare. It's when
So does
when
that
the
mean
story's
like
done, it's done.
I mean, we'll talk about it next week.
Yeah, next week.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
a lot.
Next week.
That's a lot.
So,
Welcome to comics. Let's talk about the intricacies of publishing manga.
I know, and
Next week.
thank you, by the way. We're going to do our best to get to as many of those Twitter questions as we can because I put out the call for questions. Some of the questions are a bit advanced, and we're going to bank them for future episodes.
yeah, no, this is a great list, guys.
Excellent.
I'll get to it.
So, our next big topic, we've talked about what are comics. Our next big topic is, how do you read them? This has been one of the most common questions we've gotten. And the truth is that there is a learning curve to it. A lot of us, if you grew up on Asterix or Tintin or Betty and Veronica, you pick up that language pretty early. But if you haven't grown up with it, it can be counterintuitive. So I thought...
What a good book to start with. No, and like I say that not just as a great big fan of this book, but because their layout and design is so specific. This is
You
someone
can't
who
tell what
really...
I'm flipping through.
You're about to
3
find out
guesses.
because it's one of my favorite books being published right now.
All right. And I apologize to my Wicked and Divine train. I'm about to bend your spine all to heck.
Bring it.
Don't do this at home, kids. Yep, I did it. I did it.
I felt that.
We need to see.
No, it's okay. They'll make more.
So this is the collected edition of a comic called The Wicked and the Divine, which you have heard us go on about ad nauseum.
And again, I want to point out, like, this means, like, collected edition is, there were individual issues, there were 6 individual issues. 5 that were then put into one. But for 5 months, you got
there were
Wicked
5
and Divine
of
number
these.
1, Wicked and Divine number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5.
There were 5 of these that had content. I should have brought the single issue to compare.
No, I totally forgot.
There were 5 of these with comics and a letters column in back, and various other an individual cover for it. And they took 5 of them and they made a paperback bound edition that you can put on your bookshelf. And it is referred to, just so you know how to recognize one. It's got a spine and it says The Wicked and the Divine, and there's a little 1 at the bottom to tell you this is where to start.
I love it when they put numbers. They don't
Yeah,
always
that
put
does
numbers, but man, I love it when they put numbers.
That's actually it's a philosophical debate. Do the
Yes.
numbers turn people on or turn people off? I'm pro numbers.
I'm pro numbers.
I also am pro numbers.
This is
Kinda.
so The Wicked and Divine. They've also written the Faust Act because they gave an individual title to this collection.
And it seems like that's become almost the norm as well. Like, whereas, like, I'll have people ask me, like, hey, what Doctor Strange story should I read? It's so easy to say, oh, read The Oath. But
Yeah.
what I really want to say is, well, you need to read Marvel Premiere number 3 through number 15, but they really don't have a name for that yet. Like, so they don't have that title. You
Yeah.
know? So I'm like, it's the H.P. Lovecraft kind of inspired weird Cthulhu thing. Like,
But-
see if
but
you can
there is-
find
Yeah,
that.
long,
Like,
he's describing the titles that would adhere to the individual magazines where those stories were first published, which aren't always the same as they aren't always titles that clearly indicate the content. So Marvel Premiere doesn't say to anyone, I bet this is a Doctor Strange story.
yeah.
But
That's also where you
because-
got Adam Warlock and
Yeah.
Iron Fist and Aunt Miss Scott Lang. Like, you got all those characters in that title. So
let's practice reading.
Yes, let's practice
this
reading
is
with
gonna
one of my
be-
favorite books.
We're practicing our
Here, I
physical
can hold it
interface
while
here.
you talk if you want. I can hold
I'm
and
gonna
flip.
point.
Oh, you're gonna point. All
Ideally,
right.
'cause
I will
this
hold
is-
while you point. This is gonna be great.
This is, guys, there's nothing, like, have no fear if this is new stuff for you. I know for a lot of you it isn't. But this is the cover to issue 1, essentially. They've reproduced it without the text that would normally say The Wicked and the Divine, issue 1, and it would have the month, and it would have the, I should have brought more normal comics.
Here, I've got a Killjoys over here.
Thank you.
it's right
I'm going
there.
to show a cover.
Oh, actually,
also
this is
got-
Mosaic, which is dying. Hold on. There. It's. Oh, wait. Hold on. Here's. Do you have anything?
One sec. I've gotten distracted by
Here we go.
how to
There
read
you
a
go.
cover. So, for instance, this book is called The True Lives of the Fabulous Killjoys. This is the title. This is the publisher. They've got a little bug in the corner for Dark Horse Comics. This, and this is very common these days, this is the list of major creators that have earned top billing here. Writer Gerard Way, either co-writer or artist Sean Simon. Becky Cloonan is an artist, so let me just check what the
Just to
rules
know.
of everyone was. Yeah, the script was Gerard Way and Sean Simon. The art was by Becky Cloonan, who's a rock star.
Such a
And
good
then
book.
over here, they're telling you this is number 4. This is the 4th issue of Killjoys, and it costs $3.99, and it's got a little barcode. So this is a cover, and we will look at more examples of these as we go along the show, because in a quest to make covers eye-catching, and that quest goes badly. Sorry, thank you, Chief.
Now we're making life a little complicated for you. All right.
So,
Thank you, Zach.
we have just picked up The Wicked and the Divine. In the collected edition, there's this catchy little title page. There's a little quote. If anyone wants to dramatically read the Christopher Marlowe quote.
I can do that. Ah, Faustus, now hast thou but one bare hour to live, and then thou must be damned perpetually. Stand still, you ever-moving spheres of heaven, that time may cease and midnight never come. Then also, boom, 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 boom.
As famously uttered by the Venga Boys in Boom 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 Boom, the Party Album. These two quotes are essentially the essence of this book. Essentially the essence of. I did not just say that. So those were just your appetite winners.
I went backwards.
And we should mention that not every comic is going to have like quotes at the beginning, stuff like that. That's an artistic flourish, you know.
Here we go.
So, The Wicked and the Divine begins with one page with a number of symbols on it. It says, once again, 31 December 1923. This comic is British, so they do their dates all funky. It is written by Kieran Gillen, and the art is by Jamie McKelvey. The colors, I think, are Matt Wilson.
You're going to make me
just
flip
gonna,
again? Yeah,
sorry,
Wilson.
Yep, Matt Wilson. This page, the reading order is pretty simple. This is what is called a splash page. There are no individual divisions of story on this page. They want to make a big impression on you, which I would say they're probably doing.
There's also one other thing happening in this page. Oh, you go ahead if you're going to cover it.
Well, if I don't cover it, jump in.
All right.
The other thing that's on this page, there's an image. There's something we're seeing, and there's something we're hearing.
Now, the reason that we know that we're hearing somebody in the room is because there's a tag on that bubble. That bubble has...
This is what's called a speech bubble. And this tag normally points to whoever is speaking, but in this case, it is pointing at the edge of this huge page.
Because this itself is a close-up, and the artist wants you to focus on this image instead of the rest of the room out here.
The other interesting thing that's happened is sometimes when people are speaking, it's in a box and not in a bubble. And often that has something to do with that. Often that is designed to give you a sense that they're not necessarily in the room that you're looking at, that you're hearing kind of a voiceover.
Yep. So
that
here's
something is
a page
happening.
of Persepolis. In Moscow, it begins, so my father was not a hero. This is the author talking to us. This is a caption box. And then here are two characters talking to each other.
Oh, and go to the next panel.
Sure. If only he had been in prison.
And then there's two things happening here.
They cut my dad's leg off, but he still didn't confess. So they cut off an arm as well.
And then we have a thought bubble.
This guy's listening to this story, which I think she's making up. If I'm remembering the context correctly, she wants them to be very impressed. And this kid is going, "Wow, that's a lot."
So when a bubble is sitting there and then connected by other bubbles to a character, and those arrows will point to who's talking, so you can kind of keep track. And those bubbles
this arrow
there
points to her mouth.
So that's where she's coming in.
Points to this kid's brain.
So that's something that no one else can hear. That's just to give you a sense of what that's just a visualized thought. Thought bubbles are not heard by everybody else in the caption.
And you can tell it's that because these little disconnected bubbles, I guess.
And the reason that we know that this is a memory is because our narrator, the author, talking about his childhood, is in the square and there's no arrow pointing to anyone speaking. She is describing the scene, but not present.
So sometimes these can be omniscient. They can just say, for instance, Moscow is not really being said to us by anyone. It's just being told to us by the comic book. This, because it says my father, you can tell is in someone's voice.
This is one of those
things.
Comics
are complicated.
Comics are absolutely complicated.
But they're beautiful and wonderful, and they let you imagine. See how much story you get in just 2 panels here. She wishes her father was more impressive. She's making up a story about him getting tortured to impress these kids.
So when we go back we return to this, and we look at that skull.
We return, do we?
So we return, once again, we return to this. When we look at that skull, it's such a tiny piece of information, but the difference between this being here and then putting this in a square is that
a circle by itself.
Or a circle by itself means that this is now somebody who's removed from the event.
But there's mystery.
But we put that arrow there, there's somebody in a room with a skull.
Someone is talking and we don't know.
We don't know who.
They're in a room with this skull.
But we now know they're in there because of that little arrow. Interesting.
Very interesting.
All
There
right.
is a person, and we cannot see them. The mystery is created just by this arrow heading
Whatever
off.
voice you're hearing in your head at this point is entirely designed by you, by the way. Think about that. You've heard someone say that in your head. You don't know the gender. You don't know anything about them.
Also, I want to point out that not every single comic starts with a splash page on their first page.
No.
That's not necessarily like...
This
No,
is a choice that they made.
we're going. We're going.
Yeah.
All right, I'll flip.
Different first pages. Yeah.
Oh, God, that layout.
And the speaker is revealed, if it was the same speaker. Will there be any further gospel? Now, this is what we call a panel. This is a subdivision of a page, usually for storytelling purposes, that captures just one moment in time, or one thing that they want to draw our attention to. It is designed, a page layout is the arrangement of the elements. And sorry, if we can back out to the full page again.
Thank you, Zach.
Amazing.
Thank you. What we are looking at here is a page subdivided into one dominant top half panel and 4 panels down here, which take our attention around this room to 4 individuals that we see at this table. None of whom is saying anything because this question is not being answered.
And I'm going to point this out, which is interesting, is there's a lot of different ways to do layout, and one of the most important things, or I believe we call them the gutters, which is the space between the panels, all
between
these
the
little white
panels.
lines at the moment. And they could have done, there's a lot of different ways that you can show a room with a table and 4 people sitting at it. We showed, gutters tend to indicate, and not always, but because your brain goes one panel at a time, there's a little time that passes each time. Your focus is being pulled each time you move. So not only are we getting the table and 4 people sitting at it, we're getting a table, 1 person, 2nd person, 3rd person, 4th person. We're also indicating that no one's talking. There's time passing and no one's moving and no one's talking. This is not just a room with people. This is a room with people that no one said anything since.
In which a silence is occurring over time.
Because the panels are moving us through time.
There's almost like a sense of like, she says this and then it's tick,
Tick, tick, tick.
then it comes back to her.
And Jamie McKelvey has partially done this by using the eyes of the characters to guide us to each other, so you can see that they are sharing this moment as they go.
And up to the top of the next page.
Where we have a speaker once again. And you can see this is a much closer up, it's a close-up panel as compared to this, which is as compared to the panel we just left, which was the full figure taking up a small portion of the real estate. So this is about shot selection, something that comics share with film and other sort of presentational media, but that works a little bit different in comics.
In a lot of ways, like a comic book is sort of like an animatic, or what's the other? Not an animatic, but
Or a
like
storyboard.
storyboard. There's a lot of similarities between storyboards and comic art in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I'll get to. Oh yeah, I have a thing I'll get to later. There's a thing I'll get to later.
Important similarities and important differences. I may have forgotten to mention this, but in general, when you're reading a Western comic, you go left to right, top to bottom. So when we looked at these 2 pages, we immediately knew that this big panel on the top left gets our attention first. It is both on the top and on the left. Once we've proceeded past that one, we read the left side first and then the right side, unless the pages clearly indicate to do something else, which we will get to in a bit. These pages are separate. You can tell by the gutter right here.
Big gutter
start
across the
here,
page.
And then you go left to right. There's no conflict of up and down within these panels. So you know to go 1, 2, 3, 4.
And just
And
to make
land
sure to
here.
reiterate, in the panel itself, you also go left or right. So if there were multiple panels down here, you know, in multiple speech bubbles, it'd be like.
Oh yeah, well,
We'll get to some
we're
examples.
gonna
Yeah.
have an example. God, this book does everything. Oh, I was like, do we need another? Nope. It's Wicked and Divine. They do everything.
So
Hateful that way. Oh, thank you.
after this silence, which they've established by repeating
Oh, you
these,
got it. Thank you.
by looking at these different objects with time passing, we land back on this person who we've now begun to gather must be our narrator so far, right? We've made our guess that was probably who was talking on page 1. And she says, "Then I'll go. Once again, it's been a pleasure. I love you. I love you all." This is a close-up. "I'll miss you." Table. So, now, anyone want to talk about this page? What's happening on, for instance, these 2 panels? What
Well,
are we seeing
she's saying "I love you all," and we're focusing on the skull, and I think, and that right there, much like you mentioned storyboard, and it's important to note that, like, especially early filmmakers, a lot of early filmmakers learned their craft from comics. Like, comics were a big influence on how film tells story, and still are. It's the reason we storyboard movies, and the camera, our eye is being pulled to this skull for a brilliant reason right here, is to make sure that that she's not just talking to the people in the room, she's talking to those that are obviously gone from the room. We're making sure that the room is being addressed, not only the living people in it, but the dead. And there's no other way to do that.
Or you can also read it just as what's the subtext of this line? It is leading you into the thing she's about to say.
Yes. And that this is the last time they're ever going to see each other. For reasons
there's a great sense of foreboding in the way that it's all laid out, and the way that they're speaking, and the fact that no one else is speaking.
And that this may be the end for them. And look at that room. Look at that clock. It reminds us of another image that we saw recently with a bunch of skulls a few pages ago. Look at that. Let's flip back.
This? Sorry.
I know, you're going to be moving around a lot today.
We're very sorry, Chief.
Other side.
Thank you very much. Other side.
At the page.
Thank you.
Zach is Zach.
In the meantime, I'm going to do a film to comic shout out. The comic book artist.
Let's just do that. All right.
Most responsible for grabbing those film techniques as they were developed was this guy.
Yo, yes. So you can see we have that table again, except there are skulls and there are symbols.
Yeah, some of them are skulls and some of them are...
And we had a table where some of them were skulls and some of them were people. At the bottom of that.
Very interesting. It's this table, and we've now seen that these figures, which we recognize from the table,
are now
all belong in this layout.
So we've now established some interesting connection that will now that we have moved through. Let's so raise a glass.
Who wants to read him?
Here, I can hold it.
I
if
have
you
the
want to
easiest
come around.
access.
I'll
if
read.
You want to just keep a...
I'll read. It'll be fun.
You're the voiceover actor.
Time for a drink of 40?
No.
Then goodbye, I guess.
No, Susano. Au revoir. Just au revoir. And another silent panel. So we went left to right, top to bottom. So this one was one panel. This one, because we're looking at someone else, his answer is implied by this next one. And in response to that, we get another comment. We can see it's his back, but he's in a space with her. So these are also happening sequentially, but they're happening in one panel because we can easily process these in time. They aren't saying this simultaneously. He's said then goodbye, I guess, and she has interrupted, or not interrupted, but added no, Susano.
And
it's
again,
her
you
turn
know
to
that
talk. See,
because
she
it's
carries
left
us
to
down
right.
here.
Left to right, down. Left to right, down.
She says two things in sequence without someone else interrupting, and they let us know that by the fact that her bubbles are connected. First she says this, and then she says this. And he's intentionally, I think, left this space blank to show that no one immediately responds to that. In fact, the whole room hangs in silence for another moment. We're using the panels very much to progress time here. And then...
1,
2,
3,
4.
And then this.
Now this is interesting because I can never tell if this is people snapping 4 times or all of them snapping together.
That's actually, you could have, I don't know which
Yeah, you
one
could
we
have it
would...
Because the 1, 2, 3,
This is
4
an
comes up.
intentional ambiguity.
Yeah, and this is a book where they want you to not entirely know, but this is a thing that happens, and then there's this moment that's either during it or after. We're not entirely sure, but we have a change of scene. We're
On this
out of the
previous
room.
page, we saw her exit this room. This is what they're doing with the door frame here. Sorry, Chief. On the previous page, this mysterious speaker exited the room. You could see it behind her as she was leaving it, and they were left behind in the room. And then we don't see her again until we see her observing the house from
We've now
outside.
cut to outside.
Which gives us a sense, oh, this is the location they're in. And this, I would say, an argument for simultaneity would be the very similar layouts here and the fact that they've given them one space this way.
But there's also, they could all four be snapping 3, 4.
They could each snap 4
See,
times.
Or yeah,
I would
think
say-
they might all be snapping 1, 2, 3, 4 together. This might be the group.
I
doing
would
it
say
together.
that because
we
we've
need
got...
a Gillen McKelvey ruling on
I
this.
know.
I would say that since there's gutters here, it's individual moments in time. Otherwise, you could make an argument for one entire panel where they're all snapping at once.
Or maybe on
But
a
they've
weird
been
level,
deliberately
it's both.
laid out to have the exact same layout, which could be intended to tell us that they're simultaneous.
So one of the things that comics does really well is it creates these chronological ambiguities.
Yeah.
And that's part of the fun, is that these things can both happen at the same time at different times, and there's no way to really know, but you're going to take in all that information subconsciously anyway.
And when that happens, don't let that frustrate you so much that you stop reading.
Let it free you. So click, 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 cut to exterior,
A moment of silence and...
the other page.
Oh, no.
Explosion.
Sorry. Can we just do the page turn? Full page turn. So, full page turn. We've looked at this internal layout. We've looked at 1, 2, 3, 4.
Click,
Click.
click, click, click.
Boom.
And this is what we see. It creates both the impression there's a stark ending right here, and another, as we saw in the beginning, a dominant panel that takes up an entire half a page for something really splashy. Not a splash page, that was a poor choice of words.
But splashy all the same.
Splashy.
It makes an impression.
And we still see the figure observing it, which ties it into this previous observation panel.
Yeah, I
So
know.
the
We're going to be
page
killing you
turn
today.
here, the page turn here is about her observation of this house and what happens in the moment after.
And the fact that she's in safety while everyone else inside is now presumably dead. And
Fissure
this
exploded.
This is a slow pan down now. So we have two
this is one of
panels.
my favorite
I
things
love
that comics does.
Yeah, so what is this? What are we
This
looking
is
at here?
this is the equivalent of a camera panning down. So what you could do is you could have an entire panel of this and just show her with the house here. But what the artist has chosen to do and the writer, you have a panel above her and then you have the space, which means it's
Once
the
again,
equivalent
time
of the camera
has passed.
looking down. And that's how you should read that. Is there's a sort of like drama to it where it's like, this happened and now we're landing on her for
With
like
the
a dramatic
words.
effect.
Once again, we return.
So one other interesting thing on this page that I want to point out, which is that they do the kind of an interesting, subtle comic book version of a dissolve, which is that this explosion happening. Just go full page for this. This is just a little easier. This
Thank you,
explosion-
Zach.
Thank you, man. You're rocking it. This explosion happens, and if you can almost imagine, you can see the fire is raining down from that panel. Like the whole page is always an interesting thing, and the fire raining down, it's almost like the explosion happens, and in that you start to see the pieces fall, and our focus pulls, and now we see the building,
And
and we
this is...
follow the fire down, and we see her standing there.
We will get into this more later, and we had a number of questions on this front, but this is one of the reasons that the evolution of comics right now and the adoption of digital reading techniques is likely to change them in the long term. Because most comics that we will talk about in here were designed initially to be read in print. And so there's a specific effect when you see this entire page and read its individual pieces that is different from the effect you would get if you saw only this panel, followed by only this panel, followed by only this panel. They function in a way which is specific to this format. Now you can preserve that digital experience if you read it a full page, if you open a full page at a time. But it's one of the reasons that that's such an interesting evolution, because we don't know how people will change their storytelling for these new modes, and we don't know what the effect of existing stories, because it is slightly different. If your page turn is not a physical page turn, you're having a slightly different effect, because the pause in your mental calculations as you're doing this, which can be replicated by hitting the page next button, but it can be replicated by hitting the page next button, but it's different if the same button you hit to take you from panel to panel takes you between those pages.
Yeah.
It's just an interesting question. There's no bad thing, and whatever form you read it in, as long as you get access to this art and story, fantastic.
Yeah.
But I wanted to keep going just a little bit more.
Because we now have this again.
Yeah, so what is this?
This is that same image from the beginning, except brand new symbols, no skulls, and 3 empty spaces.
If you can give us the 2 pages again, I'm holding the intervening pages. And this is the thing that I love about comics that makes them like books and not like movies. When you get to this page, you can stop and go back and be like, okay, wait. This looks just like that thing I just saw, but with important differences.
And I gotta say that the ability to do this at the same time is entirely intentional. There's a reason there's a white page at the beginning of this book of just a blank, is so that the pages appear in the proper order, so that you can actually fan it out and see both pages at the same time. It is utterly intentional. Look
But again,
at that.
any form you can get access to it, and it's great.
And we have a new date.
Yeah.
New title, new date.
So it's helping us to decode this information by saying, we don't know what these dates mean, but we know that we should compare them. That there should be something about 31 December 1923 and 1st January 2014
And
that
boy,
sets us thinking.
And that 1, 2, 3, 4.
Didn't we just
apparently
hear
a
that
thing.
somewhere?
We just heard it, and we just saw it in the 1, 2, 3, 4 snaps.
Which is why I think the snaps are also 1, 2, 3, 4.
I still think it was one snap.
No, it's
No, we gotta find
different
out.
times.
It's so fascinating, isn't it?
Or maybe they each had to do it one at a time for it to happen.
Yeah, click, click,
Okay,
click,
anyway,
click. It's
our,
so fun.
our debate goes on. But we have a new batch of symbols, a new circle, and a new layout. Wait, give us the 2 pages. Just
Yeah,
always
just
start
2.
by giving us the 2 pages.
Thank you, Zach.
Thanks, man.
I'm excited, and that's why I sound angry. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. You're good.
So we start with, this one is very interesting because it is obviously designed to work as 2 pages, but he knows that you won't know exactly how to read this, so look what helpful aids we have.
Click, click, click.
What are we looking at here? Is this a speech bubble? Who's saying broccoli?
It took me a second to say broccoli, South London. Apparently the book is saying it. Not a person, but the book. It's this nice square that's just telling you where you are. It's practically
There is
text
a
on
caption
screen.
box.
It's the equivalent
We can start
also of
zooming in
like
now. Thank you, Zach. Sorry.
it's kind of the equivalent of like sort of a like in Captain America Civil War when it's like Brooklyn.
Yep.
It's that same exact thing. No one is
One
saying
reason we all
this.
got so excited when they kept doing that in that
And-
because
Yeah.
it felt like comics.
And
Yeah.
you can see the font is very clean. The
It's
font
quite
is sharp.
different from the font that we just saw when people were talking.
Well, we're about to see people talk also, so that'll help.
Yep.
Well, we're
but
about
this
to see a
page is all-
narrator.
So what's very interesting is that they are now using different visual elements of text to tell us different things. This is information. Sorry.
Poor-
This
Poor
is
Zach.
information. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1st January 2014. This down here was speech by this character. This up here in the all caps and the very thin letters is apparently how they're going to do things like give us location information. Broccoli, South London. And then this is a new font. What's this mean? What's this thing? Who's talking? Is the house talking? Are the cars talking?
We don't know, but there's a voiceover. We have a voiceover.
It's not that I'm afraid my parents wouldn't approve. Left or right? I'm afraid they would. So that's already an intriguing beginning. Whoever's talking right now, they have parents, and they have some complicated feelings about those parents. Next panel. I want this to be all mine. And this is where we maybe begin to form our guess about who exactly is saying I and my parent in these little boxes. Now they've given it rounded edges, which is a way that they're telling us also that these are thoughts. It's a little bit similar to the thought bubble that we saw in Persepolis. So 1, these 2 ideas. And then the
and
number.
again, we also don't have the trail connecting to her mouth, which is why we know it's a voiceover. But since it's using first person, we can also ascertain that it's
Start to
voiceover.
assume that it's
Yeah.
start
Yeah.
to assume it's her.
Because-
it may turn out not to be, but
Right, but we start to form our guesses as to who is talking and why. And a
It would-
smart writer is always using that to their advantage.
Because it
It's
would
a guess.
otherwise say she's afraid instead of
Yeah.
I'm afraid.
Yep.
So
moving down.
So we've gone left to right, top to bottom.
Left to right, top to bottom.
number
and to
2.
the bottom.
Now it's a name we haven't heard. Amaterasu's only been around for a couple of weeks. Amaterasu. How many of these girls have even seen her? Ooh.
Oh.
So now we've got other characters and a named character. So this is, if we're following this jacket person, they've just arrived in a space.
A bathroom.
Looks like a bathroom, see the sinks? With other people. Yet, here we are.
Top of the next page.
This is a close-up. What are we seeing here?
Oh, we're not there yet. There we go.
there we go.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Top of the next page. It's a close-up of something.
Looks like it might be like a makeup bag with a wig in it or something.
3. Next thought. The eyeliner, another line in the sand.
Down?
Yep.
Oh, we can just do that one.
Once again, I
these are
step
going
over.
Okay.
Yeah.
That'll be easier so we're not moving around.
The eyeliner, another line in the sand. Once again, I step over. Less and less of me ever returns. Good. The stranger in the mirror looks back. I wish I was her.
Down
She
one
looks
more.
like a god. Now we're pretty sure that this is her, right? Because her actions are tracking this. We have a pretty good guess that the girl in the with the brown hair and the green jacket has just transformed herself before our eyes into this girl. With we can see the makeup right here, the hint of what has happened in between these two panels. She put the wig on. She put the makeup on. We had already seen a hint of other girls doing the same process, and we've hit number 4. She looks like a god.
Beat.
Almost. These 2 pages, which I just talked through endlessly, are 2 of my favorite pages because they form one monologue. Normally not interrupted by someone describing everything. Very sorry to your reading rhythm. But they carry you meet a person and you come to know a lot about her in the space of 2 apparently simple pages where she's just talking in her head about her own feelings and looking at herself.
8 panels and 4 numbers.
Whew! And yeah, full disclosure, which is maybe too personal, like the first time I dyed my hair any color, this ran through my head. Another line in the sand.
Yeah. I feel you.
And we have a page turn. What is this? This is the reason that I requested 2 pages every time we turn a page. Because every once in a while, you get one of these.
You get a giant
What's
full
this
page.
called?
This is a splash, correct?
Yeah, it's
this
a
is
double page splash. Or a
Double page
2-page
splash.
If you have
Have my
one, it's
brain
a
on it.
splash. If you have 2, it's a 2-page or a double page. I mean, obviously, you can.
Now, there's a
figure
lot of
out
good
why.
things that are happening here. They're careful not to put anything important on the crease, but to definitely make you understand that it's one piece of art.
So this is, you can see a lot of cues that are telling you, this time, treat these 2 pages like one. And those cues are that the lines start over here and they extend over here. Her skirt billows back across both. There are all these small ways that the artist has to let us know, this time, it's one giant panel across 2 pages.
One might say a super panel.
Sure,
Sure.
I like it.
Super panel.
Super panel.
Super panel. Hey, there's our girl.
Yeah.
Look at her. There she is, right in the crowd.
She has made it right from her uncertainty to some kind of new attitude. She's standing out from the people around her. She's colored more brightly. And by this time, we know that this is the face we associate with these little guys.
With that voice.
Saying, she's just 17. No one believes it. She's not 17. She's immortal.
And this is close to the center of the page, which is where your eye sort of immediately can assume.
But she's a little bit off-centered, too. She's centered on this page, but she's off-centered in the entire composition, because this composition is about her regarding her. Who we might guess, because we got a name on the previous page, is this Amaterasu?
Amaterasu.
And it's almost like a very worshipful.
I would say so. That we've got this big, bright, glowing thing, and you can also see a couple of the other people in the audience have done the similarly colored hair and makeup.
It's a follow-up of what we saw with the other girls getting ready in the bathroom.
Even though hers is similar but different, she's the one who has taken the idea and slightly morphed it. She is not doing the blue. She's not doing the blue that the other girls have been doing. It's a purple. That might be important later, but not in this issue.
In this setting, it looks it looks like a stage. It looks like a stage with lights. So what we get now is the idea that she snuck out to see some kind of gig. She's in the bathroom getting ready, and this person's on stage. And that was where I had planned to sort of wrap up the Wicked demo.
Unless you want to go any further, I feel like that's a really good break. It's we don't have to get into the.
Oh shoot! You know what?
Although actually that last thing.
Yeah, I was gonna skip this page because
it.
There's some inappropriate content on this page, but not really.
But let's. This is kind of this. I think just talking about this panel layout right here, we don't even have to talk about what's happening.
Darn it, we didn't mean to just make this 2 hours of Gillen McKelly, but it turns out this book is
2 hours of Gillen McKelly
good.
is totally doable.
So what you're going to get on this page is her experiencing this gig. Do we have time to do this?
We don't even let's just talk about what happens here, because this panel, I mean, like, we don't even have to talk about the story. We can just talk about this bottom.
But you
panel
can
right
see
here.
at a glance what is happening. That this character we've been following is at this sort of what looks like a musical gig with this almost divine performer, and you get a panel on the bottom of the first page where we get her eyes very intensely, and that's sort of the moment of contact. And so we come back to the effect on our girl, who is once again centered in the top panel here. We go left, right.
We see people
We have a
fainting
moment
around her.
of contact. People are losing it.
And then
Infinity passes. A moment of hubris. I want everything you have. And then I'm gone.
And
Best
she
gig
faints.
ever, FYI. And what's happening? What are these?
Look at these tiny there's nothing even happening at these bottom panels. We're going down there.
Bottom panels.
Okay, right.
There we go. No, we're good. Okay. And you can see the panels are actually using this to kind of bring us out of consciousness. This is they're getting smaller and smaller and smaller. She's left the panel at this point. She's fainted out of it. And then there's just no...
So this is a collaboration between Jamie McKelvey drawing it and Matt Wilson doing the colors, where you can see as her experience is changing, the colors are changing in this way that almost represents your vision going strange as you are kind of passing out. As she's literally falling out of the panel and they are getting smaller and smaller, those chunks of time are becoming less coherent because your experience of events that's been in her head this whole time is going absolutely away until you wake up.
Until she wakes up somewhere else.
In a dramatically different color scheme, in an obviously different room, without her wig on, everything has changed.
She still has her makeup on, though, right?
White.
Still makeup and
without
no
her
wig.
wig.
No wig,
That's what
yeah.
I meant to say. Thank you. And we meet a new character that we
Saw on the cover, but we'll get to later.
Yep. So yeah.
Yeah, welcome to panel design. And the thing is there's no end to how panel design works. Panels move you through time in interesting ways. People get
Or through ideas.
or through ideas. They get so creative with how panels work. Hi, we actually should probably take some questions.
Yeah. I'm gonna very quickly,
yeah.
just because we wanted to cover it a little
Wrap
bit.
it, yeah.
That was a good example of standard panel designs. If you want to do it with Japanese comics, you do the same thing but backwards.
Oh, yes.
So we will briefly go over this, and we'll cover it a bit more next week. But where in the comics we just read, you would have started here, gone here, and here. You just do the same thing but backwards. You go here to here to here. Actually, sorry.
It can be very
Yeah.
disconcerting. It's basically left-handed comic books.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yes. I swear. I've
Welcome to
done this.
manga.
I'm freaking out
I'm
because
going to
I
have to
do
come up with
read
a
this
really
all
good
the
name
time.
for next week.
Yeah.
I'll come up with something ancient and fun. Oh.
Yeah. Okay. Duh. I'm not crazy. Hey, I bet Kaitlin's gonna. I bet this person's gonna just suggest going somewhere tomorrow. Better pack that picnic basket. I will. And so that night, here he is preparing for this picnic date they're gonna have, while she's dreaming away. And the next day, we're on our picnic date. So sorry for the briefly forgetting how to read there. It happens to everyone, especially when you've tried to demonstrate it to people on the internet out of nowhere. It takes some practice, but it's the same principle applied to reading as you go.
So, some good questions from the audience. How much of page layout is determined by the writer, and how much is a conversation between the writer, artist, publisher from Glory Cave? Hi, Glory Cave.
That is a fantastic question, and that's going to depend completely on the creative partnership.
It is entirely, I don't want to say, it is entirely dependent on how the writer, some writers don't even like to give the slightest information to the artists. Some like to have partnerships with people where they know and they can actually collaborate. Some people, I want to say Alan Moore famously called artists and had he famously had during his, he worked on a run of ABC books where he would call each artist he wanted to work with and literally said, what kind of comic would you draw if you could draw any comic you wanted? What would be the thing that would make you happiest? And they'd be like, I've always wanted to do like old school 50s sci-fi. And so he would just write an issue of 50s sci-fi for those characters and hand it to that artist.
Have
But
you
what's
ever-
interesting is that he also is famous for being one of when he chooses to, he is one of the most specific writers in the world in terms of telling artists exactly what should go
Where?
in each panel.
His scripts, like the scripts that he'll write have like dissertations on a philosophy behind one panel. Like it's like intense reading. Like a lot of artists or writers will be like, here's basically a screenplay. Like if you've ever read a Bendis script, a lot of that he kind of
Panel
writes
1.
in like panel 1, panel 2, panel 3. Now we're on to page 2, panel 1, panel 2, page 3, panel 1, panel 2, panel 3. And sometimes he'll describe the panel, sometimes not. Again, it depends on the artist. But
And he'll write a lot of dialogue.
Of course.
Bendis is a big dialogue
guy.
These are two different comic book writers. Alan Moore is a very famous comic book writer, author of Watchmen, among many other classics. Brian Bendis is a sort of more modern classic.
He's kind of like
writer,
the modern
Marvel of the
architect
last
for a
50
lot of
years.
Marvel, yeah.
Yeah.
And his lots of dialogue, way more succinct scripts, but Alan Moore will write philosophy for one panel. Like,
Sure.
here's what I'm trying to get at with this one character. It comes from this kind of philosophy, like, so.
And there's a third and older alternative, which is known as the Marvel style.
The Marvel,
from
the
60s.
Marvel style.
When a lot of the classic Marvel comics came in the early 60s from the collaboration of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And the Marvel method of doing that storytelling, or what became known as it, was essentially that Stan Lee would, rather than saying in panel 1 this happens, in panel 2 this happens, he'd say, okay, here's what's going to happen in this issue. The Fantastic Four are going to fight some shape-shifting aliens. And he would sort of lay out the things that would occur, and Kirby would go home and decide what that looked like on a page. And then Stan would go back through, take the art Kirby had turned in, and start deciding what everybody said afterwards. And
Yes.
it only works with the right partners. They were the right partners.
It's got a weird scrapbook feel, and it's why I'm a huge Kirby fan.
And it let Kirby flex his muscles in terms of what he thought you should be looking at and how the action should proceed.
And thank you. And it allowed. And there are people and there are books. I'm trying to find something. Is there
This
something?
is all sci-fi.
This is a little too tight.
Doesn't get a chance to be as dynamic
But
as that one, yeah.
but it allowed Kirby to really like. You'll get this very staccato, like the way that time moves in Kirby books because of the way that the dialogue was decided later is very weird and always a little off kilter and makes you feel it's like not to say my favorite books cause nausea, but there's something a little grip the table weird about it where the amount of things people say is not necessarily reflected in how much energy is happening in the book, which is powerful and intense and almost hallucinogenic, but like very, okay, I'm holding on. What's happening? It's that first 30 seconds of Space Mountain.
Have you ever read Bendis? Like Bendis did a book on how to write for comics.
Yeah.
Kind of.
I need to read that one, actually.
It's good.
It's really good. And in it, he basically says, yes, I'm the writer, but before I write any book, I talk to the artist to find out how they want to work with me. I look at their artwork from previous things to find out how they work so I can
Right.
adapt my writing style to them. Because, as he says, it's like I can write it, I can come up with all this crazy great dialogue and some wonderful plot twists, but at the end of the day, it's the artist whose work you're looking at and enjoying. I'm just kind of guiding their hand in a way. But his big thing is, I let them decide. Like, I might have a suggestion on layout that's specific to the story, and I'll let them know. But 9 times out of 10, I'm just like, hey, here's kind of what I think is going on. Here's how many panels I think should be on the page, but what do you think?
And some books move at a very simple tempo, and each panel kind of just moves at the speed of dialogue. People talk, cut.
What do you mean by
cut.
speed?
What do I mean by speed? Okay, I'll do this one. The thing that comic books, that really, for me, that the comics do, and the interesting thing that happens is that, whereas a movie, you have an editor deciding the speed at which the movie takes. Right? We film all this stuff, we make a movie, you film people talking, you film events, maybe you do a little CG, whatever, and then there's a guy in a room who decides how many seconds we spend looking at one thing before moving to the next thing, And as anybody who's ever worked with film or cutting video knows, that is everything. As much as an actor makes a movie or a director makes a movie, an editor has, on a weird level, so much more control than either of those people. And every now and then I'll see a movie with like an actor who's just like really bad, and my first thought is, what did they do to piss off the editor? Holy cow. It's not, wow, they're a bad actor. It's like, oh no, I've seen you act. You must have really made him angry because he just decided to make you look like shit. He has tempoed this to make you feel awkward, and because an editor can hide. They're like a tailor. They put it together and they can hide so much.
Yeah, the film comes together in editing
so much. With comics, you kind of get to be the editor. The tempo of speed of speech, and this is one of those things that I was really fascinated by the notion of what we call motion comics, which was a big, like, we have the internet now, let's make comics internet-y, and we wanted to put dialogue and music to comics. And it while I love the notion and I would love to do more of it because I'm fascinated by it and I have things in my head that we haven't tried, it never really quite works, because the thing that makes comic books work is that you're the editor. You decide the speed at which you go panel to panel. You decide the speed at which the dialogue is happening.
You control the flow of information.
You are speeding up and slowing down time as you read, and the panels are helping showing you kind of the guidebook. It's like a coloring book in that sense of like of chronology by numbers, where that'll move you in the right. Once you get used to the language of it, it just sort of moves you through the story. But you decide how fast you go down that slide. And whether or not you go back to see somewhere else in the story if something was important. But
whether you linger on a page or whether you tear through a bunch of them and then reread it at your leisure.
Yeah, it's really that's what the speed of a comic book is that notion of how quickly you can go through the dialogue and how quickly we linger on somebody sitting at a table having a long speech, or are they in the middle of a fight having a long speech? And that's fascinating.
But as you say, we control it, but the writer and artist have this enormous toolbox of ways to guide us in one direction or another. For instance, all of those empty panels sitting at the table we just talked about.
Oh, we have that.
Which is, I think, is fascinating, like in terms of like time. Like
yeah,
in
sure.
a panel.
There's an internal. Here's a panel that has internal chronology. Holy cow!
This is one of the things. Like, and when you get used to comics, like we are, like you kind of take it for granted. But Scott McCloud in his book points out this panel isn't all taking place at the same time. Like, I'll go through it real quick. You've got
Smile.
That flash is blinding, Uncle Henry. Hee hee. Oh, Henry, put that camera away, will you? Oh, let him be, Mom. He's just having fun. Well, if old Henry is gonna have much more fun, we may have to lock up the wine cellar. Check. Sure you want to move that, Jed? So what you've got, this is not all like this frame, if you don't know any better, could dictate 1 second of time. But what you really have here is, you can almost imagine a gutter here and here, almost as if it's moving across, but it's capturing it all at one time.
But even this guy is pausing between the sections of his speech, indicated by this line cutting the bubble off almost entirely.
Because as you see here, they're playing chess, so yes, he's talking to the party behind him, but he's still playing chess over here. So he goes, check. And this guy says, sure you want to move there, Jed? So it's kind of a very simple thing, but if you don't know any better, you would wonder, is this all happening at the same time? But it's not. You've got 5 seconds, 5 seconds, and 5 seconds, kind of like individual moments.
Although when you read it, you've decided for yourself exactly how quickly all those things overlap based on cues in the environment around. This is a pretty calm scene, so there's nothing to really tell you that everybody's shouting at once, and there's a pretty natural sequence between their comments, so you imagine this in a conversational way. The gestures and expressions are not particularly like, no one's doing this, like a Kirby way of indicating.
There you go. And one of the things that can happen in a panel like this, and I couldn't even imagine we would find an example, is that you could have two people talking, and then we could have a couple lines where they like hop to another part of the panel and keep talking if they're fighting, or hop to another part of the panel and keep talking. And even though it's one panel, we get the sense that they're moving through that panel still talking, even though there's not a gutter there.
Which brings us back to Family Circus.
Which brings us
and
back to
representing a person inhabiting more than one moment in time in one panel, because when little Jeffy runs around, it's a...
He's running. There's time happening. It's just this condensed moment. Kirby, I always felt the best way, because so many of his poses are dynamic, even though there's so much dialogue, is you're supposed to infer that there's a larger action happening, even though we've just snapshotted this one intense moment. They're hopping around. This dialogue is happening in a dynamic, kinetic setting. It can. I know it throws some people off when they see this very kinetic pose and 15 lines of dialogue. That is a common complaint I've heard from people getting into comics, is that like somebody in full action pose going, "You may think you've defeated me, but I still have one trick up my sleeve. That's right. Any second now, the condenser will explode and we will all die." You know?
I have a perfect example of that, and I wish that I'd brought Secret War with.
God, I know.
Because there's a moment where I believe it's Pile Driver. Is that Pile Driver from the Wrecking Crew? Right?
Yeah.
Am I right? He's run. So they're on Battle World, and he's running at Hawkeye, and Hawkeye has his bow drawn. And for an entire page, they're just yelling at each other as Pile Driver runs at him, and Hawkeye just sits there with his bow drawn. And it, like, as a reader, I'm just like, just shoot him, just shoot him. But you have to understand that, like,
there's a lot happening there.
There's a lot happening. They can't fit all of that into one panel, so it's broken up a little bit.
And it's your job to use your brain to use the imagination to fill in all the things that are in the gutter. The gutter is almost between panels is almost your cue to imagine something. Every gutter is a moment to understand that your brain has to do a little shift.
Yes.
God, that's so beautifully simple.
Hawkeye
is simple and basic.
Yeah.
I'm seeing if I can find any examples in here.
Another question while we're Glory Cave actually doubles up. I feel bad that I'm doubling this. Is why do we often have a separate artist and colorist? We also often have a penciler and an inker.
So American comics evolved in a particular way where the roles got divided up, and this was in some respects for elements of speed. To division of labor makes comics happen faster. And it also happened because, especially back then, the colors were a separate process, and you needed to know sort of these like arcane secrets of cutting out shapes from a thing to apply colors. So colorist became an art form that was quite different from putting lines on paper. And you could give directions to the colorist, but like unless you wanted to mess with these actual sticky printing plates and chemicals, then the coloring job was sort of not your forte. You would give instructions to the person who understood what your color palette was capable of. And the reason we say 4 color funnies is that there was a printing process dominant in American comics for a long time where you essentially made everything out of 4 colors in different mixtures.
One of the reasons that the Hulk started off gray but then became green is because they had a hard time with that particular process creating the color gray. So they were like, well, green's a lot easier, so he's green now.
Yep. Comics.
Japan Rose, by the way, just because I know a couple people weren't here for it, wanted a reiteration of gutter. Gutter, when we use that term, is the white space. Actually, it might just be up there. The white space between panels, or sometimes black space. The little lines that exist on these pages that aren't
right here,
that divide those moments.
Right here.
Anything that isn't panel, and sometimes things break the gutter. Like this character over here is actually running through a gutter right there. The blue girl.
What would you say is the benefit, the narrative benefit of breaking a panel?
Oh, I love it.
Time.
It connects moments. There's a lot of effects for it. This was something I called out.
People get really fancy with it. It's like the narrative. What's the narrative use of lighting in film? Like it is basically just such a big tool that is hard to pin down.
So one is time. One is to connect the events of 2 different panels. One is just to provide a different perspective on something with what you're looking at. I wrote an article for our website when our friend Jody Hauser's first issue of Faith came out.
Jody, I know you now. Hi. We met at
She's the
WonderCon.
best.
She's the best.
She writes a book called Faith for Valiant Comics, which is about a superhero who is, like, depending on your preferred terminology, she's plus-sized and amazing and fabulous and can fly. And the panel borders in that first issue of Faith are only broken a couple times, and it's usually by her, like her head extending slightly outside the edge, and it serves in that comic to sort of give her this heroic stature that sort of like, she's someone who can fly. She could burst out of a panel at any minute. And you get that information. A, that she's the most important here, and B, that she is this like irrepressible force because she's literally bursting through some of these panels.
A film version of this is what they call breaking the frame. Like Fight Club, which is actually a really good film if you just want to learn something about how film is made. One of the things that you can notice in Fight Club that's the film version of this is Brad Pitt's character, and spoilers if you haven't seen Fight Club, who's a little different, has a little bit of a difference from the rest of the characters in this film for a reason I won't cover. his character hops out of frame. He's very bouncy, and his character hops out of frame all the time, and head is cut off by the frame and kind of leaves frame and comes back. And
Except
he's really
in film, they don't get to do things comics can do. You can't actually show someone outside the frame yet.
So everybody else is usually very well framed in this film, except for his character, who's constant. And that's a visual cue that the director's giving that there's something different about this character. Is that he's hard to contain. The movie's having a hard time containing him. And it's a really, again, it's this kind of subtle narrative that we can give. And I assure you, and I know some people don't believe in subtext. I have met them. It is absolutely intentional. There is no way not to create.
Subtext.
There are people who don't believe in subtext.
What does that mean?
I know.
I don't know.
I'd have a metaphor, but they wouldn't understand it.
Hey,
Burn! Yeah, no, subtext is all.
Burn to the folks who don't get
Subtext is the
subtext.
reason we make movies and comics and all of this. Subtext is just kind of the whole point.
Text is good too.
It is, well, text is great. Subtext is,
Let's see.
what else can we say? Why do they call it a splash page? Since we're just here,
That's a great question.
Autistic Cosplay,
think-
who's one of our regular favorites.
I think it's just because it's
It makes
splashed
it
on the
splash?
page. It makes a splash.
Yeah, I don't know where. Like, I wouldn't know the etymology. I'll look that up. Somebody smarter than me would know.
Yeah.
But it's.
Why do they call it? Maybe
I've always
Eisner
just-
talks about it.
I've always just assumed. Yeah.
Eisner might.
Control F splash on that real quick.
I know.
Yeah.
I've just always imagined it was because like splash. Here's a giant page. Splash. But I don't know.
So what happens when Sandman's speech bubbles is black and the font is white? So speech bubbles, this is the thing, is we're explaining the tools here. And the whole thing about these, the great thing about art and how art rules work, and I love this, I had a great teacher who explained this, is the whole reason for having rules in art and rules in film and rules in drawing and narrative and construction is so that you can find interesting ways of smudging them. And not quite breaking them, because anybody can break a rule, but it's kind of, there's a genius to figuring out a way around it. And Sandman uses a lot of those narrative tools where they like take the rules of comics and understand how to subvert them. And changing the little bubble to black and the text to white is a very good way of indicating without audio to the reader that there's something about this voice that's just almost the opposite
It's
of a
voice.
human voice.
Yeah. It's got a quality to it that is different,
Like
and it has to be a visual quality because this is comics, and all we have are visuals.
Like a strange resonance, almost like an echo to the voice. Like I've
Maybe.
always heard it as like a my name. Like there's something like almost like a growl or a gravitas. To it.
I've always heard it in my head, and this is what is great about comics is everybody's head is different.
Yeah, mine's not so deep.
Mine's
Really?
always been because of audio mixing. I've always thought that they've taken him. I hear him out of the. He's not in the centers. He's in the side channels, and it's been just slightly sharpened so that he's not actually coming from him as a person. He's just coming from the room he's in. Even though his mouth is moving, it's just it's like the Haunted Mansion opening where it's just everywhere.
And again, Taliesin points something out that's great. It's reader.
you.
It's up to you. It's reader response. It's in your head. No one else is getting the same exact.
It's not even that
comic
there's
book
no right
reading
answer. There's
experience
no wrong answer.
as you.
Better.
Like so, anytime you read Watchmen, you're reading a different story than I am.
With different voices.
With different voices
and a different speed.
And a different speed. It's a completely different story.
What?
But
I
all
do
of you
love
will
that-
always say that Dr. Manhattan and Mars is the best.
I love Dr. Manhattan and
We
Mars.
could have saved a lot of time. I forgot Eisner actually just has a chart.
He made a
this
chart.
Is the classic pre-McLeod work, Comics in Sequential Art by Will Eisner, after whom the comic book awards are named, because he was such an important innovator in the field. And he's, made us a handy-dandy chart of reading a comic book page, because he's complaining about it as an artist. In sequential art, the artist must, from the outset, secure control of the reader's attention and dictate the sequence in which the reader will follow the narrative. The limitations inherent in the technology are both obstacle and asset in the attempt to accomplish this. Tendency of the reader's eye to wander. On any given page, for example, there is absolutely no way in which the artist can prevent the reading of the last panel before the first. And what's great is this text is very much designed for him to be like, how do you make the readers do it? Whereas we, as readers, get to approach this from what are the cool things they can do because they have these tools and obstacles.
Which is why my favorite tool of comic book, and we've briefly talked about, my favorite tool of comic book storytelling is the turning of the page. Is the best way to like surprise and shock. It's our version of the jump scare, except where in film jump scares are kind of lame in my opinion. They're fun, but like that's like anybody can do a jump scare. a bottle of soda well shaken can do a jump scare. These things are not difficult. but a page turn where you're reading, and you flip the page, and suddenly there's just something there that slaps you in the face. Animal Man has one of the greatest page turns I've ever seen. Animal Man's page turn was so good I dropped the book.
Which Animal Man?
The
That's
one.
the worst
I don't want to spoil
compliment I have ever. Oh, you mean literally dropped it?
I went, ha! I dropped it. I
thought
actually.
you meant you stopped reading.
Oh
because
no!
the
I
page was too good.
threw the book across the room because I was really tired and I was a little caffeinated to stay up and read. And I was just flipping. I'm like, this is cool. This is no. Whoa, ho, ho.
Comics.
The Arizona. I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't read it, but
Okay.
like,
We'll talk.
yeah,
We'll talk.
Animal Man. Animal
talk.
Man will
He
happen.
doesn't explain why it's called a splash. Now it's
Okay, talk quickly about the difference between comics and storyboards that you mentioned before. The difference is mostly the audience. Storyboards have to be very concise.
Well, a storyboard has to be something very specific. A storyboard is always going to occupy the entire visual space. Each thing is intended to take up the entire visual space, which means by definition, the space the shape of it is always the same. And what you vary is what goes inside it and how those elements are arranged. And this is very, very different from comics, and something I like to emphasize, where if you come from a film background and you're looking at comics, one of the first things you have to practice is knowing that the shape of your space can change. Because your page may always look like this, but if you break it up into a series of identical chunks, you are missing out on the possibilities of the form you've chosen. Because by subdividing it into different, like those panels of someone passing out, that is quite different from something you can do with a storyboard. The panels that get skinnier and skinnier as they go are fundamentally different, even though they're doing the same thing as a storyboard, which is communicating story information within a rectangle.
They're not helpful.
They're
for a
functioning
storyboard.
quite differently.
Storyboards also serve a very perfunctory purpose. So a lot of times, like a storyboard will dictate camera movement with actual arrows.
Yeah.
In the frame. So whereas
That's the other
I'm
thing
trying
they
to-
get to do that we don't. Their camera can move. Ours,
Yeah, like
ours
because
is
it's a
the
very
eye.
it serves like an actual purpose where it's like this is a storyboard that is dictating where the camera is going, how far it's coming back, is it zooming in, is it zooming out, where are the characters walking within it. So a lot of times there will be arrows that show that, and a storyboard is typically
It's a blueprint to a story.
it's a blueprint to a story in a lot of ways. So
Whereas a comic
you
book
know,
is
whereas
a story.
like in a comic,
the
you know,
story,
you
yeah.
have page composition where you've got like the individual panels and you follow it in this way.
Watchmen.
A storyboard will have boxes that are all the exact same size, and you'll have an arrow pointing here, then an arrow pointing here, and an arrow pointing here. And in the frame, if you want the panel to move, instead of drawing
Oh God, what is the name of
stuff in sequence like we would in a comic, there'll just be an arrow, like an actual arrow drawn in there, or it'll be drawn up to show that the camera pans up. So a storyboard is really by design to show where the camera moves.
We should do a call out just because we have opened it. This is what is known as the 9-panel grid. It is one of the most common old-fashioned layouts in comics, but what's interesting about them as a medium as they've evolved, this was a fairly common way to lay out a page, but it is used so well in this book, Watchmen, that anyone who now uses this arrangement of panels will usually be assumed to be doing a riff on this book. Because there's got to be filmmakers with analogous things where, like, anytime you use shot X, people think you're doing a Western riff.
It's the most common one is the
What, like a one take?
No, well, it's I was thinking even more so is the Alan oh God, I'm blanking on his name, the Love and Death, Sex and Death, Manhattan Murder Mystery.
Woody Allen?
Woody Allen and jazz music. There was actually like a 35-year period in film where you couldn't make a movie with jazz music.
Yeah.
Ever.
Well,
because they're like, no, Woody Allen does that. Like it's an entire genre of music. I can't. Ghost World complained like heavily. They're like they wouldn't let us use like 80% of the music we wanted. Like that's too Woody Allen.
Well, and Spielberg is a big fan of like the one take.
Yeah, the one take.
So a lot of people are like, oh, it's very like that, or like using kids that go on a giant adventure that's much bigger than them and involves the government or aliens. Everyone's like, oh, it's very Spielbergian. It's
the
just a story.
the Kubrick Square.
Yep,
Kubrick Square is
yep.
is like, and then with the I can't remember anybody's name. The
What
the movie about the
movies?
hotel, the movie the Royal Tenenbaums.
Yes.
Oh, Wes Anderson.
Wes Anderson's is very theater. He's very big on like character, foreground, background. It's
Yeah.
kind of very theatrical.
Wow.
He also, speaking of which, he's one of the people. I think he's a comic book fan, and my theory for this is that his movie about the hotels has 3 different aspect ratios.
Oh, interesting.
He's actually one of the few filmmakers, and Legion did this as well, where
who
they would
plays with
change
aspect ratio?
They actually change the aspect ratio depending on what's happening in the film.
So let me show
Very
you, just to
interesting.
go back to the storyboards and
Yeah,
finalize
okay,
this. This
yeah.
is something that I was looking for. So in this panel of The Watchmen, you get a fluid motion between frames where you have Night Owl and Silk Spectre, and here the vehicle's called Artie, right? Artemis, or am I correct?
The owl ship?
The owl ship, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Archimedes.
Archimedes, thank you. So you've got it here, then you move here, then you move here. So if this was a storyboard for, say, a commercial or film or television, you would have this entire panel like this, but you would have the actors here, they would have an arrow drawing over, and then you'd have the characters here, and you would also draw an arrow up here or down here to signify the motion of the actual
Hi, everybody.
And once
camera.
again, these
Hi,
little
wait.
bubbles are telling you who's talking.
Yeah.
We have a
a
Just an FYI.
We're offline, aren't we?
No, we're not.
Okay.
We're good.
Oh no, we've been off the whole time.
Yeah, the show has never gone out. No, we need to move a piece of equipment in the back that cannot wait because we have to move to fix an air.
We will
AC
be
thing.
very loud.
So just know it's going to be some beeps and that just fine. Everything's fine. It's
Cool.
all fine here. How are you?
We're all fine here. How are you?
One of the things people ask, is sequential time in panels more common than simultaneous time? Extremely.
Yeah.
One of the things, there's just almost no point without sequential time. It does happen, it's usually done as like flare,
Do you mean like multiple panels that, like a panel and then another
simultaneous
panel that's the same
time, like
moment in
things
time?
happening at the same time, is actually really is much less common than sequential time. Sequential time is just, wow, those are sounds. Sequential time is just, it's necessary for storytelling.
In general, yeah. If you wanted to pick something happening in the same moment, you usually try to put it in the same panel. Although, what you will get is, for dramatic effect, like, if in the moments before, like, an explosion or a really dramatic thing, you might get a little look at several things around the room or several people, which you can interpret either as, like, the last couple seconds look around the room before the thing happens, or a simultaneous look at everyone in the moment before what's about to occur. So that would essentially be, it's the exception that proves the rule. If you are trying to make something simultaneous with multiple panels, you're usually doing it because you want to emphasize that this moment in time is really something.
It's perfect.
Again, it's a tool you can use.
Another good one from Fickle Fandoms is sometimes a random word in a sentence is in bold or in all caps the way that doesn't seem like, it's not like putting questions in front of a sentence. Why is that done and what does it mean? The bolding of random words, they're not random. The bolding of words, do you
Of
want to?
apparently arbitrary words?
They're not arbitrary. It's used. It's a system, and it's really interesting. As somebody who deals in dialogue, is what they're trying to do is express cadence. And let me find something from like Killjoys that have this. Yeah, like here's a bit of, and I'm not even going to show it. I'm just going to like what they're trying to know is they're trying to give you where the emphasis in the sentence sits so that the dialogue moves. Killjoys doesn't do it very often.
Here.
I
They
found
do.
some in
I've
this
got
40s
some-
Wonder Woman.
I've got
wait.
some. So this is Joss Whedon's run on X-Men, Astonishing X-Men. So
Whedon
you
does
have
it.
you have Cyclops talking to Nick Fury. He says here, the X-Men saved Manhattan, Colonel, after your boy Magneto turned it into a pretzel. Our boy. All right, so you've got 2 bolded words here. So the way, at least this is the way I would read it.
Here. Do you actually let me do? You take Nick. I'll take Scott.
Amazing.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So
right.
you're Scott.
The X-Men saved Manhattan, Colonel.
After your boy Magneto turned it into a pretzel.
Our boy?
So
It's just a little punch.
it's a little punch. So, and what they're doing, like he's emphasizing the word boy. It's almost as if like he's been
Well,
insulted,
because-
or like, what do you mean by
Because
boy?
our
Like,
boy
he's a man?
question
Like,
mark means who do you mean? It could mean who's our boy?
Yeah, who's our like? So
Our
there's
boy? Our
there's
boy?
emphasis
Our
on
boy?
that, and there's emphasis on save because so this comes down to this is almost the dialogue artist, the letterer.
Letter-
This is almost the letterer putting like
They're
being the
acting.
acting. Like
Yeah.
the letterer is almost like kind of the actor in a lot of ways, where he's decided that Cyclops is emphasizing the word save because that's what his character wants to point out to Nick. He's saying the X-Men saved Manhattan. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, you hit
wanted
that.
to
You
make
hit
fun
that
of
point
this.
to create dialogue.
Yeah.
I wanted to make fun of this as just a thing that Whedon would do because he's a film guy, but I also found it in this 40s Wonder Woman.
Oh no, it's old.
This contest
works.
is a free-for-all. That's essentially it's saying that the way a person would deliver this they're worried. This is a big chunk of text. This is a big, basically unreadable chunk of text. It says this contest is a free-for-all. You will lasso an opponent, pull her to the ground, and tie her up. Attendants will furnish fresh lariats and carry defeated contestants off the field. That's a lot, right?
This contest is a free-for-all. Exposition.
They want to get your attention on that. You'll also notice that a bunch of times they'll just bold Wonder Woman here to sort of remind you what you're doing and which words are most important. They don't do it every time because it's the 40s and we're not that consistent. But again, it does help to guide you through this page where your brain's going, wow, that's a lot of words. And it is, because 40s comics are an evolving storytelling medium.
It helps your brain to understand what, and sometimes it's like, and let me show you like one where it's really, it just helps your brain to create the actor's performance in your head. This is like, here's an interesting chunk of dialogue from Karnak. I'm going to see if he's got another one. Warren does this really well. Where sometimes it's not like sometimes it's just a small word that gets it. Like in Karnak, and I'm going to put Karnak up here, and this bottom, he's got this big chunk of text,
And it's we want the boy recovered and rehabilitated. You've worked with Terrigen victims before. The strain of the change and the stress of the abduction means he needs significant help. We've only bolded and. We've only bolded and in this panel. I know I didn't tell you where it was. And it's because we want to emphasize that that's compounded, even though and is not the most important word, but it's the word where you need to know that you're tilting up on it, that you're giving it a little bit of a punch, that you're bringing the emphasis to the and how that's important for the read of the dialogue.
And also, like that...
Oh, yeah, there we go.
This is just a fun conversation between the two Hawkeyes, Kate Bishop and Clint Barton, where she's basically making fun of all of his trick arrows. And we have here, Fishnet kind of fell out of this one. And then he says, "Oh, Kate, come on, that's my net arrow. You got to respect the gear there, Hawkeye." So, this here, boomerang arrow, Kate. It comes back to you.
Comes back to you?
It comes back to you in the end. Boomerang, respect it. Then she says, "Why the hell do you need an arrow that comes back to you after you shoot it, Clint?" So it gives a cadence,
because
an emphasis.
It gives a little bit of a Tarantino, like the over, I don't want to say overuse, but the heavy use of this is what gives us this very Tarantino back and forth dialogue. Yeah. Cheeseburger, Royale with cheese, Royale with, like you get
Royale
that
with cheese. Yeah. So
Royale with cheese is bolded there. Royale with cheese.
But again, like this is just.
It's probably something that regular prose writers wish they could get away with doing more often.
Oh my God!
But because this is a primarily visual medium, there's no reason not to vary up the method of presentation to communicate the effect you want.
The only way you can read a comic is with your eyes. So every single panel has to figure out how are you hearing it. How are they saying it? How are we trying to tell you that they're saying it? What's the emphasis?
Although,
where's the camera moving?
Side note,
like what smells? Like what doesn't smell? Like all of those senses have to be encapsulated visually.
No, that was a really good point. Because the artist is they're the set designer, the production designer, they're the costumer, they're the actors. They have a lot of work to do. But you were saying the only way you can do it is visually. But what's funny is that's completely true. But what's interesting is that since certain characters and stories have fandoms among people who can't access things visually, you get interesting things like when they recorded an audio edition of the first issue of Mark Waid's Daredevil. Because Daredevil, as a visually impaired hero, has a large following in the visually impaired community. And so they did an audio edition where they were trying to figure out how to translate that information into sound-only versions, which of course isn't comics, except as previously established that everything is comics. Including things which are not comics.
Another question: Are comics artistically done page by page or panel by panel? Page by page usually. Well, like when you're actually turning it in, if you're doing a book, you do a page at a time.
I think in terms of an artist doing the page, I think they approach it differently. But what's most common, I think, is for the person doing the initial drawing, or what we call the penciler, to start by doing a thumbnail, which is a small model of how that page might eventually look, where you sort of plot out where the bubbles are going to go.
They do kind of like a quick composition sketch, because you would call the page layout also composition, the way the page is composed, right? So they would say, like, here's how I want to compose this particular page. They might correct the author who said, like, I think that at this moment we move to page 10. They may say, actually, I can't fit that many panels on it and make it make sense. I suggest this. What do you think? And the writer and the artist will go back and forth, right?
There's so many good questions.
But a lot of times it is turned in page by page and not panel by panel.
You mentioned the 9-grid is linked with Watchmen. Are any other techniques attributed to certain creators or books? That's a good one. That's,
One of
from,
the things
that's from Frankenstein 1912.
One of the things that stood out to me that I actually didn't remember from when I read this was that Gene Colan, one of my favorite Doctor Strange artists, was the first one who really started doing motion blur in comics. And I was just like, what? Like, because I'm like, he did Doctor Strange. Oh yeah, but like that sort of motion blur, like you see even on the camera right there, you can see my hand existing in two places at once. Or multiple space. He does that in the comics. And I don't know if that's attributed to him, but he did. So
there are folks who are strongly associated with the introduction of different techniques. I don't know that there's one as specific as the 9-panel grid.
The only one I can think of is maybe the Bendis 2-page double the 2-page splash with way too much text that's really hard to follow.
The dinner party scene.
Oh God! Oh, I love him, but
there are strong, especially sort of. There are ways you can lay out a page that will instantly make people think of Jack Kirby. And it's just a sort of... There's like poses, especially, that will strongly bring him to mind. There are sort of...
I will say in Asia and Europe, it's easier to find these things, but one of the things that happened in the American industry, which I love, is that writers and artists... It's not common for writers and artists to sort of marry. They're often... playing musical chairs with each other, and because of that, and because there's more than one person, there's no one really in charge. These marriages, it's more of a card game. Is that you get so much infinite variety in the way that stories are told, and like you've got Jim Lee, and Jim Lee's art is very Jim Lee, but you put him with Frank Miller, and suddenly it is this weird amalgam of Frank Miller and Jim Lee that is kind of both more and less than the sum of its parts in this very weird creation. It's not moving at the speed of Jim Lee, but it's also not rough and tumble the way that Miller is. Because of that, it's been hard to like pin down somebody's style because they're always so jumbled.
But there are sort of signature things. George Perez is known for, like, if you want to depict an entire planet's population rising off of it at once in some sort of panel that somehow has a million tiny figures in it but still communicates clearly, that'll either be Perez or it'll remind you of Perez because he did it so well so many times. So there's sort of that, like, signature moves, almost like athletes have, where you're sort of like, there are moody shots that you'll associate with Frank Miller very strongly because he did them very well in Dark Knight Returns or in Sin City. There are layouts and there are visual elements that you can spot that sort of will immediately call to mind those bodies of work.
Anytime I see like complicated machinery in a panel, I immediately think of Kirby.
Yeah.
Like, and I don't know if that's just me. I don't know if that's an industry-wide kind of thing, but like.
But that also goes into there are specific ways of designing machines that remind us all of Kirby. Influences that he crystallized into his approach to making up fantasy technology that become very recognizable.
And they briefly touch on the non sequitur panel in here, where sometimes there'll just be a panel that doesn't seem to relate to the panel before and the panel after it. He was very, very good at making, and I don't want to call it necessarily a non sequitur panel, but knowing how to completely break the narrative in a way that made sense, where you'd be somewhere and then something else somewhere else with somebody else would happen and you would immediately go back there, and it still had that flow, and there was still, even though you just had this huge wrenching out of the narrative and then being punched back into it.
But you do get, like, independent cartoonists especially get styles which are very, very recognizable. There's a certain sort of there's a certain sort of emotional storytelling done by an independent artist like, say, Adrian Tomine or Tomine. I'm actually not sure which one of those is right, and I'm very sorry. I love your work.
I think it was great.
So his work, in this particular story, he is telling a story of many small moments. And one way we know that is that he has chosen this extremely small, like, panel size so that he can fit a ton of small moments on a page. And in his case, the way his story tells, it doesn't feel like you're racing through these. It feels like you're living through a million small moments with only a few characters in a small confined space with occasional moments of peace external to it. And this is essentially like film or any other medium. This creates a totally different mood from that enormous 2-page splash of someone performing at a rock concert that we had before. That would be very out of place in this story. It would change the tone of this story strongly.
Though,
Yep.
Though you could use it as a narrative tool if you wanted to bring.
Yeah,
like,
if you wanted to change
if you
the tone
wanted
of the
to change
story
the tone of the
strongly,
story,
a
all of a
page
sudden,
turn
yeah.
to a 2-page splash
After
would
something
be
like
very
that.
unsettling. You could almost create you could create scary effects with
But
that.
but
here.
like it would be the notion of like if for anyone who's watched How I Met Your Mother of like having How I Met Your Mother in your 5 seasons and then suddenly How I Met Your Mother we cut to a rave downtown Los Angeles, a la Strange Days, with a camera overhead, where it would almost be shockingly unsettling, and would completely change everything about the story fundamentally.
And there's nothing wrong with
There's
that.
nothing wrong with that, but it's definitely like
But
you
it's
could
an
do
artistic
it,
choice.
But
and
like,
why are you making that choice?
yeah, you would
Yeah.
have to. There was it's like you can do anything.
It's art, so it's
just
intention.
why. Here's another. Is it ever possible to read whisper text sometimes seen in comics, or is that just there without actual dialogue? If you could read it, you were meant to read it. It's usually just a scribble. Sometimes when people are talking and you don't want the reader to know what they're saying, they'll just put a little cursive splash. That's not
For
readable.
instance, in the original Sin comic, when Thor discovered that he was unworthy, that little scribble for, what was it, 2-3 years?
Yeah.
People were like zooming in as best as they could, and all it ever said was, skibbitter.
Skibbitter.
You know, and it was like, it doesn't say anything.
Comics.
And we just found out, like, a couple months ago
here's
what
another
was
one.
actually said. You know?
Question: how come some comics only use exclamation points and question marks to finish
That
sentences?
is a cool and detailed question. There are different traditions that have evolved over time. For instance, the fact that we write all the dialogue in all caps, that's basically arbitrary. It's very clear and easy to look at, and we all got used to it, so that became
Legibility.
the way most things are presented is in a version of all caps,
Yeah.
especially designed for comics. And the same with which punctuation we keep and which we discard. Like the M dash, the long dash has remained, but a lot of periods just don't end up in the comic.
It's almost periods.
If they
almost
aren't helping communicate what's going on, they're
they
discarded.
kind of get in the way, and you want to make it as simple as possible. It's also, I will say, it's an interesting thing. I work with a lot of translated scripts in my work from Japanese, and an interesting thing that happens with Japanese to English is that an enormous number of exclamation points just show up kind of arbitrarily. Over the years, I've been figuring out why translators will just decide to add to a 25-page script 90 exclamation points, and it's one of those where sometimes there are readers who don't necessarily know what they're used for, and so just have decided that it means emphasis, and so oftentimes an exclamation point will just be kind of a throwaway for this is important, but all the dialogue in this book is important, so it all gets exclamation points, which is very much.
Do we have some good Twitter questions? I saw a few of them.
There were a lot
have
of great
so
questions.
many
about this. I
questions.
hope we've covered some of them. Liz Zen had asked, said there's a lot of visual shorthand going on in comics. How do I learn how to read the images for movement and emotion? And I hope that we've covered a little bit of that. But the other part of the answer, of course, is just a lot of practice.
Time and be willing, and this is important to understand that a lot of this is up to you, and you get to decide what's right. I mean, you sit and you absorb this art, and your interpretation of it is important. It's not. There's not a right or. There's not really a right or wrong answer.
Except one of us is right about how many snaps there are, and we will never know which one.
That's 1, 2, 3, 4, and
we
it's
all
in
agree they
sequence.
all snap.
But it is in sequence.
But
It's not-
but
I
that is.
never want to know.
That is I never want to know. That is a book where the chronology of events is actually always weird. Like they take advantage so many times of like you didn't really think about how much time passed between those 2 panels, did you? Or those 5 panels, did you? No, I didn't. Oh shit.
We had
trying to
also
find-
Julia Haplo, Fickle Fingernails, had asked, I try to read comics like books and end up frustrated and unfulfilled. How do I stop my attention from focusing just on the text? And she said, unfortunately, I'm aware that this question kind of boils down to how do I appreciate art, and I'm not sure you can cover it. But there is a real answer here.
I've got one too, so you go ahead
Okay,
first.
my answer would be that sort of paradoxically, if you find yourself focusing more on the text, seek out words that are drawing heavily on the non-text visuals for their storytelling. The book won't make sense unless you engage with the rest of the pictures. So a lot of like writer-artists are probably going to be very good for you here because they're more likely to be using background elements to convey really essential story information, and that can really help you to sink into a world. And even though it's very, very wordy, folks like Alison Bechtel, I highly recommend, because the denser the text is, the more time you have to spend decoding those images, and you'll find it very rewarding.
So a trick I learned, because especially when I got back into comics after being out of it for a little while, a thing that has helped me is if I'm reading a book and I have the time, and if I'm sitting and reading the time, when I open the page, before I do anything, I just spend about 2 full slow breaths, about 10 seconds, not reading, but just looking at both pages and just sort of taking it in, looking at how the panel breaks work, looking at the characters move across the screen, sort of taking in the scene, then going panel by panel, stopping, and then just slowing myself and allowing myself to breathe, have a full breath on every panel, look at the art, read it, look at the art again, move to the next one, look at the art, read it, move to the art again, taking it as a whole, coming down, then going to the next page. I'm at the bottom, I read it, whole page. I'm not looking at any text yet. I'm just looking at 2 people enter a room, there are people crying. That's as far as I've needed to get. So
Frustrating Eisner, because you immediately looked at the entire page, and he does not get to control exactly what order you do it in.
But you know
Eisen
what?
doesn't get to control me, Kirby, all the way.
I'm the exact same way. Like, who was it that asked the question? Do you have it still pulled up there?
Fickle fingernails.
Yeah.
I'm
Julia.
very similar to Julia because I'm very much like language focused, narrative focused. What's the story? So I have the same problem as you, where I have to remind myself periodically, like, whoa, there's a lot of artwork here. There are pages where there have been times where I'll go for pages and not realize I haven't looked at the art, except like just as almost a service to the story instead of seeing the whole picture.
And mysteries can be good practice here, because they force you to start paying attention to the background details, because things that didn't have dialogue will become important in the story, and you will miss them. A background character who becomes important later, that you have to go back and revisit to realize was there the whole time, that's something you can do in comics, because you're looking at a whole room. And so you can plant information in the background, then, like, leaning into stories that take a lot of decoding is one way, I think, to maybe train up that instinct.
This is just one I have to. This is actually 2 different questions. One is like, why are there less thought bubbles these days? Which is a thing.
Ooh.
And there are. Thought bubbles have kind of thinned out a bit. And this is, comics get influenced a lot by film techniques, but how are the new comic books movies getting influenced by comic book techniques? And this question is actually kind of like, this is one of those questions that not necessarily the question itself is kind of reversed. Comics have been influencing film just barely longer than film has been influencing comics. If you want to know a guy who really, the guy who figured out that comic books had a lot to say about film, there's a guy named Orson Welles, who dug his comics.
You know what's so interesting?
And there's a lot of comic book artists who really dug a guy named Orson Welles.
Yeah, Eisner literally talks about the night he saw Citizen Kane and went home and went, we gotta rethink comics! There's all kinds of things we can do!
Comic books and film have been in constant collaboration since day one, and trying to pin down. There's another movie that has an enormous amount of Japanese manga and anime. A beautiful movie that has a lot of manga and anime influence is Dark City.
I need to see Dark City.
Dark City is a great way to see a Japanese comics influence on a very American or European film. This conversation, Jodorowsky and his The Man Who Almost Made Dune, and it's actually a big comic book. We will do a Jodorowsky episode, Lord. But this conversation has been going on forever, and like, it doesn't happen in moments. It's like pointing to like any long dinner conversation. It's just been days and hours of people.
Well, and again, like that goes back to the similarities.
Hi, Tess.
Yes, I have not met you, but I admire you from afar, and I really, I love your work, and I'm really excited about your Black Crown book, Tess Fowler, who has just tweeted, you have a comic book artist who has just tweeted, you have no idea how badly I want to climb through my screen and discuss this with them.
Are we getting
Please
everything
come on our
right?
show, Tess.
Are we getting it
She's
right or
coming on our
wrong?
show. She's coming on our show.
Are we getting it right or wrong? And does she have? Are we
I
saying
know, is
everything
this a
incorrectly?
good climb through the screen or
Yeah,
like
is
a
this?
bad
Are
climb
we
through the
frustrating
screen?
you?
She knows exactly what sandwich she has to bring to make this happen. Sorry. Hi there. Yeah, are there large print versions of comics? That's another interesting one.
Ooh, this is, okay, one person talked about advantages of digital comics. Probably legibility, a real big one. your screen probably has accessibility features and zoom features that will make, like, there's got to be a huge point in favor of digital comics that you can probably much more easily change them to make them work for you and your reading conditions.
The frustrating thing about digital comics for me is that I like to see the whole page. Like, it drives me nuts when I can't see the composition of the whole
Usually
page.
there's a setting you
There's
can
a
mess
setting.
with.
There is.
Usually.
But-
that will let you decide what way you want to be presented.
But it's just small enough
Yeah.
when it's like in the full page that it's a little bit harder to read than a little bit of a larger size.
Yeah.
So I always alternate back and forth. Like, periodically, I'll be like, there was about 9 frames. I'm going to pull out, look at the whole page, go back, you know.
A couple things I just because this is a question that I really want to make sure that we cover really quick. Is what would you recommend to comic fans on a seriously limited budget?
Ooh.
And there's 2 easy things I recommend for comic book fans on a seriously limited budget.
I want to hear if they're the same as mine.
If you have a computer, there's lots of free comics, or lots of free comics on Comixology that if you can get access, if you have that, but if you don't even have that, there's Free Comic Book Day that happens.
First Saturday in May every year is a special day called Free Comic Book Day, where your friendly local comic book store, if they are able to participate and interested in doing so, will have a number of special editions that you can just sample that each publisher has prepared, where it's sort of like, here's our Wonder Woman issue for Free Comic Book Day, please enjoy.
And then my favorite, your local public library.
Yeah, that was my answer.
Your local public library, quite possibly, most likely, has an amazing
They do.
selection.
They do. The Pasadena Library is fantastic. Yeah.
And a lot of them have now partnered up with digital services like Hoopla to allow you to rent digital comics. In addition to that, there are also library services.
Also, let me throw out, maybe this is what you were going to say.
Yeah, probably. I said the word library, but what I mean is...
Marvel Unlimited,
Yeah.
Comixology Unlimited. So, Marvel Unlimited, I believe, is $10 a month. Comixology, I think, is $8 or $9 a month. So, for just $20 a month, you have access. Marvel Unlimited, I think, has 50,000 comics on their
Books
service.
that you can
just
books
read.
that you can just read for free on the app.
For
It's-
a monthly.
For a monthly fee of $10. And then if you can afford $20 a month, you get access to all those Marvel books, and you get access to all the Comixology Unlimited
There's
is a
tons
lot
of
of
stuff.
Image,
It's
Dark Horse,
rotating
like
offerings,
it's
but they're also, like, Comixology is... And there was one of the other Twitter questions was recommendations for how to get digital comics. And the leader in the industry right now is the site Comixology. They've got an app. You can buy things on their site. They are now working with an increasing number of, like, every major American publisher and a ton of
one.
Japanese. And who's not on Comixology?
I think Dark Horse.
Oh,
There's
they're
like
on the wrong
one.
thing.
Yeah. Comixology
most-
spelled Comixology.
Yes, like
It's an
mixology,
X.
but with comics.
Amazon.
Which we have to get into comics with an X and Undergrounds at some point.
Oh, yeah.
Drink for that. We're
There you
mentioning
go.
it.
There you go.
This is but they're also carrying a ton of European and Japanese and other titles. They're expanding, and they even have a way for independent artists to submit themselves to be sold on the store. So
In
you're getting
fact-
a ton of offerings.
Zach, our lovely engineer producer,
Chief,
has a comic on Comixology called
what?
Kid Cup.
Kid Cup. I haven't read it yet. I just found out it existed, Zach. I'm sorry, I haven't read your comic yet.
Zach, if you want to show a picture of it, you're more than welcome to. We'll totally allow it for our show. If you want to show a
And
picture
if
of
anybody wants to run a
Comixology.
link through the chat, we would be super
We'd be
into
super,
it.
we'd be super into it.
Here he comes!
Oh.
Yay! There he is.
This is Zach. by
Hey
the way.
guys.
It's Kid Cup. Zach
Yeah,
wrote
I'm trying
it.
to keep
This
up with
is
us
the
today.
this is the book that
Thank you, by
I,
the way, for your amazing
Yeah.
work. As
Yeah.
always.
No, I'm
Running-
glad you guys
Today.
enjoyed that.
Running the board.
Um,
There we go.
yeah, thank you guys for the shout out. I really appreciate it. I
Yeah.
didn't expect it. Yeah.
We did, we literally didn't work.
I saw a way to throw it in. I was like, hey, we forgot to do that last week. Zach.
This is me and my writing partner Greg Goodness wrote this little comedy book. It's like 10 pages long. It was what we could make about a small 6-year-old child who is the darkest, most violent detective on the LAPD.
You know the LAPD, there we
Yeah.
are.
Hey, Chief. I hear you've been talking poop about me. The character Chief in this, unrelated to me. I would say don't go further.
No, I'm not going to. That's why I stopped.
Not for children.
Kid Cop, not for kids.
But thank you guys.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
kid tested, not mother approved.
Yeah. That's the fun thing about Comixology is like if you make a book, you just submit it, and there's an approval process, but anyone can put up their comics on there. And I made it. We made
treasure
it
trove.
as cheap as we could possibly do. They wouldn't let us give it away.
Yeah.
But 99 cents.
There's
99
a lot of 99-cent.
Comixology Submit has a ton of independent artists and writers and just stuff you'd never think existed.
It's so good.
But yeah, check it out.
Check it out.
Zach,
If you read it, please tweet me at that Zach Wilson because I want to hear
How much
about
you loved
people.
it.
Or if you didn't, we want to know. Was it too violent?
Now-
it might.
Too much kid, not enough cop.
The other dominant
much cop, not
type
enough
of
kid.
question that we got going into this was basically for recommendations and jumping on points. It's the number one hunger, and
Yeah.
this was more of a technical, like, welcome to comics. We may look, but our mission every week essentially is to help try to answer those questions of like where to start, where to jump in. The answer is. I'd love to just end with this spiel. There is no wrong way to love comics. There's no wrong way to start reading them. There is no wrong way to share them, like, to share that love with other folks. I guess now I'm overthinking it. Don't be rude. There's wrong ways to do everything. But loving comics themselves, you can't do that wrong. Please, like, if you have ever read and been affected by a story told with words and pictures, you are part of our community already, and we're glad you're here. So yeah, thanks so
gotta
much
wrap
for
it up, yeah.
watching.
Yeah, it's time to wrap.
Honestly,
Next week,
if you
manga,
are,
which I will remember how to read. I've done it every day of my life.
I know,
and
I
I'm
feel
just-
you.
and I just want to say, like, if you already have a giant understanding of comics and you love comics already, but you've never read this book, this will give you a brand new appreciation for the thing that you already love.
And oh my
That's
god,
fantastic.
tweet me about the page turns. The page turns in the first chapter of this book are like
We gotta
he's a mad genius.
Yeah, we gotta wrap it up. We gotta wrap it up.
go. You do your.
I'm Amy Dallen. You can find me in Enthusiasm and here.
I'm Taliesin Jaffe. You can find me at Executive Golf anywhere that matters.
I'm at the Matt Key. You can find me on the Popcorn Talk Network when I do my Marvel show on Tuesdays, and sometimes I'm on Screen Junkies, and on Wednesdays I'm here.
Everybody.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching. Hope we educated you.
Welcome.